Hello and welcome back to the Golden Fanfics. I hope you enjoyed today's very special video. What if Deku was Chainsaw Man? Made by Just Low. And the story will be linked in the description like always. So leave a like, subscribe, and comment for another part. Now let's get into the fanfic. The Devil You Know. Chapter 10. Izuku's head sinks into a palpable pillow, heavy thoughts weighing heavily on the soft cushion just as much as the boy. Beneath him are equally supple bedsheets, his fatigued form laying still. The only movement made is the slow slide of his fingers along the string attached to his sternum. Izuku's skin feels the wire, his hand running up and down it to keep himself aware of its physical existence. The small cord is the exact same that had operated as Pochita's tail. The boy can tell not just by look, but also by touch. He lays atop his bed, sleepless from how many nightmares made him relive the incident in which he lost the dog. He may have gained a quirk, but the pulley connected to his heart feels like something he could use to pull it out at this point. For all his years that Izuku longed for a quirk, he would have never traded a life for one, human or animal. The cord is coarse, as rough as reality. It's not soft or comforting like Pochita's fuzz had been or the cushioning he lay on now. The dangling of the wire matches the unease of his mind as he thinks about his quirk. He'll always be grateful for Pochita's sacrifice, unwilling to let the dog's death be in vain, but he also feels condemned by his new power. The ridicule Izuku underwent when he was quirkless is no better than the treatment he's received being called a villain. It's just that the boy can't help but feel the quirk isn't his in the first place. When somebody says his quirk is villainous, he feels as though they're saying Pochita is villainous and not himself. He'd rather they just blame him even if that's what they mean. Izuku is drawn from his rumination by the light rap of someone's knuckles on his door. When it pushes open, he's not all that surprised to see his mother on the other side. Neither of them say anything, an ambient noise filling the silence instead. Inko eventually takes the initiative and closes the distance so that she can sit on the edge of her son's bed. Once she does, she takes to coddling him as usual. Her hands stroke at his head, fingers coursing through his curly green hair. "Wanna talk?" Inko speaks in a soft soothing voice that treats her son as delicately as her petting strokes. Izuku responds with a small insipid shake of his head anyways. Which leads the mother to sigh and say as coaxingly as possible, "You know it's not good to hold it in." Izuku's fingers curl around the string that he's been holding, clinging to it tighter. There's nothing to hold in, he knows what he's saying isn't true when his hand brushes against his chest and he faintly feels the beat of his heart. "Sweetie. You barely touched your Katsuden, and you'd normally be in the living room watching the Hero Network about this time." Inko frets over him as she brushes hair strands away from his eyes to look at him better. Izuku's glossy gaze shifts away from her. "Instead, you're in your room sulking." Inko keeps prodding at her son's inherited green locks in an effort to make him look at her again. "I'm not sulking," Izuku pouts as he pulls his head away from her hand. Inko stops petting him so that he can sit up. He shrugs while trying to come up with an excuse, "I'm just not hungry." All Inko has to do is look to her left to see a bookshelf of hero merch or her right to see a notebook full of study scribbles for her to counter with a question, "And what about your hero analysis?" Izuku looks at the book that he put so much time into writing. Then falls backwards to flop on his bed. What's the point? He's not sure if he's bitter or sad as he mumbles, "Everybody says I'm gonna turn into a villain instead anyways." Inko's eyes expand, flaring like her nostrils as rage consumes her. "Who's saying that?" She stands up as adrenaline floods her system to go after whoever dared to hurt her son's feelings. Motherly instincts have her clenching her hands into fists. "Izuku, tell me who's saying those awful things to you." She wants to know who to direct her anger at as she moves to grab the landline phone off the wall. "Is it the boys at your school? Whose mother do I have to call?" "Mom?" "It's not." Izuku shoots up to stop her before she can dial any numbers. Inko pauses with the phone in her hand, tone hanging in the air with her fuming breaths as she listens. "It's not worth it." Izuku hangs his head and backs away as he tries convincing her to hang up. "You should let me decide that," Inko huffs, but puts the phone back anyways. Izuku returns to his bed and she follows to sit beside him before asking, "Would you like to be homeschooled from now on?" Izuku somberly shakes his head. "No. It's not just them, Mom." He looks into her eyes so that she understands and doesn't reflexively freak out again. Inko frowns, but doesn't get up or revert back to shouting. "What about Katsuki? Does he try sticking up for you?" She places a hand over her son's as she tries finding a saving grace in the problem at the very least. Though all she does is make Izuku break their eye contact. He's unable to tell her the truth. That his childhood friend had become his bully and joined in on the teasing. That Katsuki is the ringleader of the squadron. That he no longer has any friends at all. I miss Pachita. Izuku's eyes start to water when he thinks about the one last true friend that he did have. Inko pulls her son into a hug, holding him close. Oh, dear. I know you do, she rubs his back in an attempt to console him as he begins crying. The ambience now consists of Izuku's sobs. She doesn't let him go until he finishes letting out his pent-up sorrow. I do too, you know. I owe Pachita a debt for saving my son if what you say is true, she offers her son an encouraging smile in an attempt to cheer him up. Izuku blinks, drying the last of his tears as he registers his mother's words. A debt. Like a contract, and he suddenly remembers what Pachita had said to him in their final moments together when being granted his quirk. Inko squeezes her son's shoulder when she sees his distant stare. He's brought back and meets her gaze. Mom. My dream to become a hero. Izuku nearly chokes on his words and has to pause due to being at the risk of crying again. His hand trembles as he returns it to the string attached to his sternum. Do you think with this quirk that I can do it now? His fingers wrap around the wire and hold it tight. Inko's mouth opens, her response hanging empty in the air. Her son had asked her a variation of this same question before when he had been quirkless. Then, she told him that she was sorry, essentially saying there was no chance for him to make his dream a reality. Now though. Yes, Izuku. You can become a hero, she chooses to support her son to show him that he isn't alone. Not even when he breaks down. The two of them will pour their hearts out to the other as much as they have to, crying in a huge embrace as many times as they must. Izuku's string sways on his chest during the hug, wagging like Pachita's tail. Chapter 11. Fizzling white noise echoes through the room from where television static overtakes half a giant display of monitors. All of Class 1 huddle together to stare at the screens in shock, just behind their hero training teacher, who's mutually surprised by the lack of visual feed. The CCTV's glow flickers across their range of expressive faces in the dimly lit confined space, as they listen to the crackling hiss of a lost signal. Bakugo blew out the cameras. The boy with a lightning streak in his blonde hair breaks the group's awestruck silence first with an obnoxious shout of the obvious. He removes the sunglasses that came with his hero costume to check if his eyes are deceiving him, unable to see in the dark with their blue-tinted lens. We can't even tell what's happening. The short boy who quickly became his friend complains alongside him. Purple balls replace his hair, bobbing with a nodding motion he makes to further emphasize the agreed-upon problem. The pink-toned girl throws her arm out, pointing towards the array of monitors that do continue functioning properly. But look, those ones still work so that we can still watch Iida fight Uraraka, she shows them with her finger the cameras that pick up an altercation between those two. Who cares about that? The invisible girl blows off that portion of the live-streaming battle with a wave of her floating sleeves, before using them to mime doing a toss-up. Did you see the way Midoriya flipped Bakugo beside her? The blonde boy with a tail nods. He's wearing a karate gi that shows he can appreciate the move they all witnessed. Yeah, that was pretty manly. Not like Bakugo's sneak attack. Ijiro's grin flashes his pointed teeth as he too nods in agreement that the counter-attack was impressive. The girl resembling a frog shifts her gaze from the redeed back to the dysfunctional television screens. It looked like they were talking to each other, she croaks as she places a finger to her mouth in contemplative thought. The boy with an Evian head hums as he considers his classmate's comment. The cloak wrapped around his body conceals the movement of his arms crossing over his chest. Too bad we couldn't hear what they were saying. His eyes shift from monitor to monitor in search of a screen that may still display the battle between Izuku and Katsuki. The girl with her hair done into a pointed ponytail raises her hand before addressing her teacher. All Might, shouldn't you stop the fight in order to get the cameras fixed? She voices her constructive concern as respectfully as possible. All Might responds with a hefty chuckle, assuring her that everything is under control with a broad grin and a thumbs up. Nonsense. You lot may not be able to listen in on the action, but I've got a special communications channel just for occasions such as this. The hero turns his head so that the group can get a look at the small device in his ear. He points towards the small audio pod before lifting that same finger over his head as a declaration. The match will continue. The ponytail girl slowly lowers her hand, struggling with the movement of her mouth to form an argument to respond with. If you insist. She surrenders to her teacher's logic and returns to watching the soundless screens that show Tenya chasing Izuku's teammate. Aw man, I was really looking forward to seeing who won between Bakugo and Midoriya. Hanta sullenly follows suit and settles for the battle that is made available to his viewing pleasure. The ponytail girl glances over at her peers and notices one that oddly has yet to say anything. Considering how close this fellow girl is to Izuku and her current skin pigmentation, this particular student's silence is a cause for concern. "Hey Jiru, you okay? You look pale." The ponytail girl voices her worries and waves a hand in front of Kyoka's face to break her eye contact with the grainy monitors. The pinkette of the class looks over and notices Kyoka's daze too. Though she doesn't take it as seriously, smirking and taking to teasing per usual, she's probably just worried about her boyfriend. Kyoka is too shaken to get flustered this time. Out of the entire class, she's the one most invested in the brawl between Izuku and Kitsuki. All Might. She finds her voice in order to manage a desperate attempt to gain her teacher's attention. The thing is, the hero had been wrong before about being the only one able to listen in. Thanks to her quirk, Kyoka is capable of hearing the same audio All Might does. Yes. All Might turns when he hears himself being called. His eyes scan the crowd of students before landing on Kyoka. The girl timidly, and just as anxiously, taps the tips of her ear jacks together. Maybe you should tell them to take it easy on one another. They're quirks, after all. Her voice is just barely a whisper, but All Might hears her loud and clear. The abrasive roar of a chainsaw's startup left more up to their imagination than they would have liked to admit. Panta overhears Kyoka and begins massaging his chin in ponderment as he realizes something. "Oh yeah. I guess we never did get the chance to find out what Midoriya's quirk is," his thoughts vocalized, resonates with the rest of the class as a chorus of curious agreement. Ijiro connects a fist with the palm of his other hand, getting amped up just thinking about what his classmate's quirk could potentially be. His shark-toothed grin is one of excitement as he says, if it's able to go toe-to-toe with Bakugo's, it must be something strong. When the monitoring room quakes, a distant resounding boom traveling through the air, the class collectively agrees again. All Might grits his teeth together, straining to maintain his broad grin. The hero heard the pin that had been pulled from the support device that created that boom. He listened to Kitsuki explain the nature of the explosion's power being one of accumulated nitroglycerin. Yet, he also hears the continuous shrill shriek of saw blades running to know Izuku survived the detonation. Kyoka is in the same state of petrification, intently listening to every detail of the brawl's audio that accompanies that shockwave. All Might places a finger over the comm piece in his ear, pressing the device to activate the built-in mic. "Bakugo. Do that again and you'll be disqualified." He prevents the brash blonde from endangering Izuku before doing the same with the chainsaw boy, and I'm prohibiting Midoriya from using his quirk any longer. From within the damaged infrastructure of the battle building, Kitsuki sneers upon hearing All Might's orders in his ear. The blonde places a finger to the communicator in order to operate his own mic so that he can shout back, "Fuck that. I can take him. I want a fair fight." Before Kitsuki can get a response refuting him, he plucks the device out of his ear and tosses it down. Opposite of his childhood friend turned lifelong bully, Izuku shifts to do the same. "If that's what you want." A distorted growl comes through the boy's elongated fangs as he removes his own earpiece. He tosses the miniature pot aside before goading his enemy with a broad spread of his chainsaw-mounted arms, Kakin. Kitsuki's heavy boot crushes his discarded earbud, cutting off All Might's unheard shout, "No. Kid. I told you not to fucking call me that shit." Kitsuki propels himself forward with explosive bursts to close the gap between himself and his opponent. The overlapping detonations drown out All Might's yelling from Izuku's still functional earbud that lays on the floor out from the boy's ear. Izuku swings his arm blades, the sweeping motion just shy of being an arc. Kitsuki redirects himself with his explosions midair, performing an aerial maneuver that carries him over Izuku's head. When the blonde shifts his position to be directly behind the chainsaw boy, he lets off another blast from his hand. The detonation burns itself into Izuku's back. Izuku retaliates with a wild swing as he twists his body to turn around, nicking Kitsuki's shoulder. The boys back off from one another before Izuku tries moving in again, going for the legs this time. Kitsuki reaches down, snatching the attacking arm as it pushes forward. Kitsuki's free hand lets off a round of controlled bursts that help him to pivot and spin Izuku while keeping the hold. Deku. The berserker blonde slams his opponent into the ground by using the momentum as his force of strength. "You're nothing compared to me." "Don't be so sure," Izuku grinds out through his pointed gritted fangs. The saw blade fixed to his skull makes it easy to keep Kitsuki at bay as he turns his body around. Then, Izuku sweeps forwards with a mad rush that really forces the blonde to go on the defensive. A frenzy of swipes pushes Kitsuki back and Kitsuki hisses when the teeth of a chainsaw come close to splitting the hairs on his head. "You're just swinging your chainsaws around, asshole." Kitsuki ignores the assault and meets the attack head-on with explosions. The blonde's chest is torn into, a deep gash instantly cauterized by his own burst of flames. Izuku is burned across his own chest, fire scorching his flesh. "Take me seriously and fucking apply yourself already." Kitsuki yells through his pain as he lets off another massive explosion, with the combined effort of both hands. Izuku gets blasted across the corridor and collides with the only wall that remains intact. He hardly has any time to grunt, let alone get back up, before Kitsuki is flying towards him with a punch rearing to go. The whole floor gets caught in the explosion that had been winding up in that fist, a bombing disguised as a right hook. Debris puts out the fire that erupts from the blast, as rubble rains down onto the level underneath. When the dust clears from where Izuku was caught in the explosion, he's on his butt with his arms crossed in a guarded X formation. The chainsaw bars are covered in as much ash and soot as they are blood. "You have to understand your quirk better," Kitsuki stomps through the wafting smoke as he lets off a few intimidating pops from his palms. The embers flicker and glow in the dark pit that they've created during their battle. Izuku lowers his arms to peer up at Kitsuki. The boy that had bullied him his entire childhood is now trying to give him advice. The innovative skill meshed with the fighting instinct Kitsuki has for his quirk proves there's more uses to the power than just creating explosions, and he's saying the same applies for the quirk Pachita granted Izuku. "You're the last person that I want to hear that from." Izuku's chainsaws rev back to life with his renewed sense of anger, and he rushes forward to meet the boy for another round of combat. Kitsuki grins, having successfully baited Izuku. Attached to the belt looped around his hip are a collection of actual grenades. The bomber had pulled one of the pins a while ago, long enough for the detonation to be any second now. Kitsuki tosses the whole slew of grenades, rather than just the one to get a bigger explosion as he says, "Boom." The blast blows out the windows on the stories above and destroys enough pillars to shake the entire building's foundation. Another massive burst of fire snuffs itself out in a burial of rubble. Debris continues to pepper the pit that consumes where Izuku had been, closing off the space between Kitsuki and the boy with darkness. The bombastic blonde keeps his grin on his face as he stares into the void, finding no sign of his opponent. But then he hears the whir before the belated buzz of a living chainsaw jump-started and returned to life. Kitsuki's smile drops just before the malformed frenzy of dizzying spinning metallic teeth comes barreling through the black smoke. A monstrous face of fangs and fury roars with the running of an engine. The chainsaw boy's leap is directly over the blonde, descending in a cutting motion unlike any other. The explosive teen has one shot at stopping the attack with one of his own, directing a detonation from his palms upwards. Izuku is directly upon Kitsuki when the explosion goes off. Izuku is launched through several layers of cement, breaching ceiling after ceiling. A streak of flame trails with him, following the range of fire. The orange path brightens when Kitsuki follows it with a string of more explosions to take flight and pursue Izuku. Kitsuki gets ahead of his enemy and extends a leg, raising it to be hoisted over his head. The bomber's kick collides with Izuku's stomach and receives a boost from a collection of explosions to send them rocketing back down. They slam into the ground, a final detonation marking the impact zone. Beneath Kitsuki's boots, Izuku squirms as he continues his struggle to keep fighting the explosive force of nature. Blood spews from the chainsaw boy's mouth, oozing between his fangs and dripping down his chin, while his injuries squirt bodily fluids as well. Kitsuki watches as the marred flesh slowly stretches to grow back muscle fibers at the very least. Regeneration. The blonde huffs in disbelief over the healing factor that proves itself weak but helpful to his enemy. "You were revving your engine before I kicked you, eh?" Kitsuki winds up for another blast to finish the fight, assuming he's got Izuku beat. No matter. An orange glow radiates from his palm before expanding to the rest of his hand. Heat simmers on the surface of the blonde skin. Then, he ignites the spark to take full advantage of the firepower. The blinding light of the explosion doesn't let him see how, but he feels Izuku move out from beneath him. Kitsuki curses when his own attack provides a smokescreen for the chainsaw boy to conceal himself, the only indication of his position the constant whirring of his weaponized body. The dust settles at the right moment for Izuku to reveal himself. "Your aim really sucks. You're like a damn cockroach." Kitsuki barks back as he meets Izuku's attack. Another mashup of explosions and chainsaws leave more burns and scars. The flames lick at both of the boys before they're tossed into tumbling rolls. Kitsuki heaves himself upright, straining his body to stand. He falls down, forcing himself to remain positioned by just one knee. Bitterly, he curses. However, this is more than enough. There's still one final trump card of his. His second gauntlet that stored up another bucket load of nitroglycerin sweat. Kitsuki grabs the pin and takes aim where he sees Izuku also struggling to stand up. See in hell, Deku. You damn chainsaw devil. Kitsuki spits when a drop of sweat slides down onto his lip to rid himself of the salty taste in his mouth. Just as he's about to pull the trigger and end the battle to prove his point to Izuku, something rough grabs his arm to stop him. I told you not to use that thing again, young man. All Might's radiant dark blue eyes look down on Kitsuki with what can only be disappointment. The hero's broad smile is no longer warm or inviting, but cold and shrouded by a shield of shadow that also obscures the rest of his deepened facial features. All Might tears the grenade-shaped gauntlet off of Kitsuki's arm and chucks it, Bakugo. You're disqualified. Hearing his teacher put a stop to the match, Izuku allows himself to wind down. The chainsaws sprouting from his body retract and his face begins to return to normal. Though he isn't let off the hook either. Not just yet. All Might whirls to face Izuku and reprimands him as well, and you took this too far by accepting Bakugo's challenge. The hero puts his hands on his hips, shaking his head. It pains me to do this, but I'm going to hold you both accountable for your actions here today and tell Izawa what happened, though that punishment somehow doesn't feel as bad as their physical pain or shame over having their idol express disappointment in them. Izuku lowers his gaze, not able to meet his hero's eyes. I lost. Kitsuki has a distant stare that doesn't quite meet All Might's gaze either. The knee that he'd been using to stabilize himself gives out and he topples over at the exact time Class 1 catches up to their teacher. Bakugo. Tenya shouts from the head of the pack when he sees his classmate go down. All Might turns around when he hears the call, seeing the unconscious blonde and rushes to his aid. Bakugo. Can you hear me? All Might tries shaking the boy awake. When he receives no response, he checks for vitals. When the hero confirms Kitsuki is still alive, he breathes a sigh of relief. I need a set of volunteers to bring Bakugo to Recovery Girl. All Might looks to the class for assistance, now that he has his hands full. I can take him, Ijiro steps forward with his hand raised. Students move aside so he can get up front and see the situation better. The Redeed isn't expecting to see Kitsuki covered in so many lacerations. I'll go too. Tenya is the next to volunteer. He adjusts his glasses as he explains his reasoning, he was my teammate. As such, Bakugo's health as of now should be my responsibility. Well put. All Might hands over Kitsuki along with his approval. The two boys take an end of their injured classmate to carry him off to the school nurse. Though the class didn't get to see exactly what Izuku's quirk is or what it does, they now have an idea of what it can do. That alone is enough to horrify them if their expressions are anything to go by. As Kitsuki's body is taken away, everyone recoils at the sight of so much blood. Izuku's teammate stands beside Kyoka, the two girls sharing pitying looks. What the hell is he? Some kind of devil. A member of the class speaks for most of the others as they stare at Izuku in spooked wonderment. Chapter 12. Humid air wafts over small spills of murky liquid, precipitating and giving rise to a hissed exhalation of attenuated but serried steam. Each puddle is as dark as the sepulchral surroundings, damp echoes reverberating like fleeting footfalls. Shadows sweep the spacious zone even without a source of dim lighting, the flicker of the black void, reflected by each tiny watery pool. Scratches litter the scuffed surface of the floor, the solid stone chipped and darkened like an asphalt road. A faint illumination gives way to the black vacuous abyss. Viscous fluid percolates like a cerulean lava lamp, the hefty shape of a silhouette floating from within the cylinder tank's soft glow, casting a shadow in the ever-expansive umbra of darkness that is the room itself. Wires run from the bottom of the container, each cable a different color from the rest, but all of them sharing the same haunting hum. Bobbing up and down to the susurrate tune, the delineated figure residing in the tank stirs with the filtrating fluid. Attached to the purlins and the rafters that loom overhead are a series of steel catwalks. Various metal bridges trail above as equally many cerulean containers. Hanging from the handrails is a young boy, watching with a scarlet stare obscured by long clumps of uneven hair that borders the same hue as the liquid in the tanks below him. Dried patches of skin around his eyes pull into wrinkles. He gnaws on the bottom of his chapped lip with flaxen-tinged teeth. The plain black clothes covering his body helps him to blend into the dark atmosphere. The being directly below the boy is acutely aware of the child's presence anyways. Even with a visual impairment, the lack of eyeballs to be precise, the man knows more than one may assume. Where empty sockets wallow in the marred mesh of disfigurement that is pure evil's face, is also torn tissue where a nose should be. Yet, the seated sinister force is one to be reckoned with, his heightened sense of hearing having him tilt his head to turn an ear and listen. A wicked smile graces the man's lips, presenting pearly white teeth close to ivory. The grin resides behind an as equally crystal clear ventilator mask, the respiratory support whirring with every intake of breath. Machines buzz behind him, large consoles plugged to even bigger modems providing a life support system. The medical equipment kept grouped together produces the sounds of a hospital hall, just at a lower decibel to the point of being a quiet ambience. Oxygen pumps through a valve, and circuitry connects to even more wiring. Despite all this, the collection of equipment has the presence of powering a super weapon rather than keeping a human alive. The man may have taken severe damage during the battle with his greatest rival, but he still carries a vigorous aura of villainy. Doctor, a terrifying tranquil tone purrs through the parted lips of the man's grin. Like a vast expanse kept still on the surface such as the ocean, a bottomless depth of doom resides below the deceptively delicate decibel of voice. Then, a wave of wrath unbridles the sea until the disturbance becomes an overwhelming force. Status report, an authoritative switch sways all sense of direction and commands whoever gets caught in the tide to succumb to it. Green circular lenses twist to give the man's presence an attentive look. A short-statured scientist sits atop his own chair, albeit with less electronics engineered into its mechanical workings. The portly doctor wears a set of customized goggles that provide him with night vision to see in the dark, the usage of his eyes still detrimental to him unlike his master. My liege. The Nomu has taken to my trial and testing, the scientist smooths out his bushy mustache with one hand, while using the other to operate his chairlift with a joystick. It's finally responsive. He lowers himself to be positioned across from his creation that resides within a preservation tank. The doctor's master broadens his grin until it's as deep as the crevices of his scarred face. Excellent, the foreboding reply lingers in the eerie echo of the chamber before he continues. If the nerve damage can be successfully reduced for a plentitude transference of quirks, then the next phase of my plan can commence. The bioengineered Nomu that the villain speaks of floats in its tank. The pink brain organ exposed atop its head. Gashes where more glaring results of operation covered the creature's body lay dormant with the rest of it. A broad beak full of fangs is slightly parted, the maw making for a mouth that can't speak. It is. The doctor pauses to carefully consider the word he'll use to describe his progress, significant his mustache furrows with the curl of his lips. However, not enough for. He proceeds with caution as he admits there's still work to be done, human trials. I see, the smile coming from the scientist's master diminishes at that news. The man taps his index finger on the armrest of his chair, done as impatiently as the movement is done thoughtfully. A moment passes before he asks with a slight leer, what seems to be the delay, doctor? The doctor swallows his own spit, mouth suddenly gone dry. He nearly mistakes the saliva for blood, a copper tinge to the taste startling him. The Nomu is primitive in its intelligence. He busies himself with explaining his creation's drawbacks. In an attempt to quell his nerves, I made it compliant with orders. It's obedient to a fault. The invention stares out at him like a dead fish from its tank, except it requires those tasks in order to function. The exposed brain stitched and stapled to the base of the monster's skull is essentially disabled. I'm afraid it's otherwise completely without a mind of its own, unable to think for itself. The scientist looks away from the malformed beast to gauge his master's reaction. The man hums as he mulls over the doctor's diagnosis of the Nomu. A result of my quirk transference. The mind was not able to handle it all. He rests his jaw on the knuckles of his propped arm after inquiring for more information. Partially, the doctor shifts his chair with his joystick to maneuver himself to be in front of a computer station. Well, I have been working to remedy the extent to which the human body will allow such a strain of quirks. A few taps and clicks of his keyboard pulls up schematics and other scientific jargon. You also asked me to alter the brain to stimulate your quirk's invasion to form a symbiotic relationship. The doctor plays a simulation on the screen to show the metaphorically rotted fruits of his labor. And this is the result of the experiment. The doctor's master turns his head to look away from the monitor and returns his general gaze to the direction of the Nomu. Even without a set of eyes, he can somehow see. A millennia of accumulating quirks does more than enough to generate other means of sight. Whether echolocation and sonar as a bat perceives things suffices or infrared heat wave detection works, those are just a few ways to name a few. Trial and error, my lord. The doctor bows as low as he can go from the confines of his chair. After paying his respect, he sits back up and repositions his seat to shift back towards his master. I vow to resolve the issue eventually. We've already begun forcing memories in and out. The malicious man angles his head towards the boy in the rafters above him as he speaks. A smile begins to reshape itself across his faulted features despite his next sentence. I don't believe we have the time necessary to dally in that department anymore, dear doctor. The scientist scrunches up his face with confusion. Unlike his master, he is unaware of the boy's presence to find the open discussion humorous in any way. What would you have me do? He treads carefully as he asks for elaboration. We begin transferring quirks in small dosages to strengthen Tamura's immunity. The boy on the catwalk somehow flinches and freezes at the same time when he hears his name mentioned. A draft overtakes the room as though somebody opened a window, sending shivers down Tamura's spine as he bends down to hear better. The doctor feels as equally cold when his master levels an eyeless gaze with him. I think it's about time we provide the boy with a pet, don't you? The mad scientist sneaks a glance towards one of his other bioengineered creations. One that he kept for himself. It's a small rendition of the Nomu, one of the failures. It cocks its head like a curious animal, its exposed brain not fully comprehending its own existence. The harmless creature makes its creator slightly protective as he pleads for it to stay with him, not Johnny. No, not Johnny, the scientist's master smirks with a hint of amusement. He folds his hands together while leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled in a tight interwoven connectivity. I believe a dog would be more sufficient. The scientist nor Tamura are expecting that to be the villain's drawn conclusion. A dog. The doctor makes sure that he's hearing things correctly. There's no better bond than between a boy and his dog. The conniving undertone behind the man's vile grin speaks of more than just getting a child a pet. Consider this a new baseline experiment, one to further supplement the effectiveness of the end goal, and only the villain's mad scientist understands why with eyes as wide as the lens of his goggles. The decision to get Tamura a dog is self-explanatory when the doctor's master says, the only other bond that the boy has is with myself, after all. The stronger the relationship, the more willing to welcome the channeling of quirks. The doctor nods along with his master's thought process before agreeing, that could work. Oh, dear doctor. I know it will. The villainous response is full of malice, and yet the boy in the rafters is none the wiser to his current guardian's devious scheme. The child named Tamura is instead too fixated on his own hands. He stares at his open palms and the digits attached to them, twiddling his fingers. Crusted nails have specks of dust under them. He remembers the last time he had a pet dog and what happened when those hands had touched it. The destructive power of his quirk makes him fold his fingers over, willing them to never brush against his new dog's fur. He refuses to hold the animal that his sensei plans on giving him. He'll never hold the dog. He'll never hug it. Chapter 13. Clouds ruffle in ripples like a careening curtain that's been pulled back to let the sunlight shine through. Beyond the congregation of pure white nebulous are acres of bright blue. Izuku can't help but admire the sky that seems to shimmer as wind blows his hair into artistic swirls shaped similarly to the clouds above. Shade sweeps over the rooftop of UA from where he's seated on its ledge, legs dangling in the breeze. A calm serenity fills the air with the tune of chirping birds. Whole grain bread that's been toasted golden brown crunches with a thick tomato and fresh lettuce that resides between slices as Izuku takes a bite of his sandwich. An aroma wafts from the food and becomes a fragrance that the air itself seems to savor as much as the boy does. Juicy flavors, warm and cold, tingle his taste buds as he chews on the combination of wheat and vegetable. Crumbs chip away and fall into Izuku's open bento box to bounce off Ziploc-bagged orange slices and grapes. He'd gone up to the roof to have his packed lunches when he attended Aldera during junior high. Eating on the top of his school feels oddly nostalgic as he munches on a mouthful of toasted bread he bit off from the corner of his sandwich. He watches the cherry blossoms planted below billow with another breeze that blows through, mind in a daze, and his eyes entranced as pink petals flutter about in a huge flurry. Birds cease their singing and fly away, frantically flapping their wings that loose feathers float in their wake. I was wondering where you went, a feminine voice draws Izuku from his thoughts and has him turning his attention with his body to the stairwell behind him. He recognizes the girl coming from the roof accessway as his friend and classmate, but still feels his facial muscles pulling into a perturbed expression. Jiru? He wonders why she'd also be occupying the rooftop during their lunch period. Completely oblivious, he has a hard time deducing any valid reasoning. Even after she walks over to his spot to sit beside him with her own food, he can't figure it out. Dumbly, he asks, "What are you doing up here?" Ioka flicks him on the forehead as though that'll jog his brain function to start working again. "I've been looking for you, stupid." Izuku rubs his slightly sore temple as the girl huffs with disbelief. I should be the one asking you that question, a small shake of her head, has Izuku lowering his. Oh. His neck bends as he sinks his head even lower. He only raises both after so that he can nervously scratch his scalp, I guess that's fair. His fingernails run through his curly green locks, sometimes splitting hairs and sometimes getting caught in the tangled mess. I got worried when I didn't see you in the cafeteria for lunch. We normally eat together, so I thought maybe something was wrong. Kyoka picks at the rice on her tray with a plastic spork, but doesn't bother scooping any of it just yet as she side-eyes Izuku. Izuku looks away, avoiding her line of sight. His voice catches in his throat like it's his sandwich before he swallows. Slowly, he turns his head to look at Kyoka again. She waits with gentle eyes. I don't like the stares I've been getting recently. Izuku holds the girl's gaze before adding, nobody wants me there. So I figured I'd go somewhere else. Kyoka winces with her eyes, I'm sure that's not the case, but she can see where the boy is coming from as he sulks with his sandwich. Even if it is, and everybody is still freaked out about what happened with Bakugo. Who cares? She tries blowing it off with a wave of her hand to loosen him up a bit. I don't, his shrug is a small one, but he does seem to pick up on the carefree vibe. A wry smile is directed towards nobody in particular as Izuku looks up at the sky, I'm used to eating alone. Hey, Kyoka nudges him with her shoulder to remind him that she's still sitting next to him. He looks back at her as she says softly, you're not alone. Izuku's face turns a shade of red and he finds himself redirecting his gaze once again. Thanks, he mumbles his appreciation as his smile turns a bit more genuine. Kyoka blushes too, hers a tone of pink that matches the petals that have blown their way to the rooftop where she and Izuku reside. Yeah, she mumbles even quieter while looking in any direction but at the boy. A few seconds of silence pass between them before Izuku sighs and says, at least Bakugo's been avoiding me ever since. Instead of trying to start more trouble, the weight of the sandwich in the boy's hand reminds him to take a bite. Kyoka nods, spooning a mouthful of her own food. He hasn't said anything about the fight either, no matter how much Kirishima or the others ask. The flimsy spork in her hand bends as she pokes at her rice again. She recalls the class trying to get answers out of him before the bombastic blonde blew up on them. Literally. The teacher had to come and separate him from the others after setting off the sprinkler system. I'm surprised, Izuku blinks back his shock before pressing his thumb into the toasted bread of his sandwich. Kyoka tilts her head when she hears the crunch of the bun. I didn't think he'd keep my quirk to himself afterwards. The girl listens closely to the boy's whispered words that are unclear whether they're meant for her or himself. She sets her utensil down on her tray, then fixes Izuku with a sad stare. You know you can't keep it hidden from everyone forever, right? Secrets come out eventually. She tries to be as gentle as possible as she warns him of the consequences of hiding his quirk. Izuku nods before putting the remainder of his sandwich back in his bento box. I know that. I'm just not ready. He loses his appetite and closes it. You saw how they reacted by just seeing what it can do. Kyoka reaches out to touch his shoulder consolingly, but pauses mid-movement, her hand hovering in place as she thinks better of it. Her hand lowers as she tries cheering him up with words of assurance alone. Some of our classmates are nice enough that I don't think it'll bother them once they know, at least, the ones I've spoken to. Maybe. Izuku shrugs noncommittally. Quickly, he hides his somber mood with a smile meant to cheer Kyoka up instead. Don't let me stop you from making friends either way though. Kyoka blinks, taken by surprise. She shrugs in return once she recovers. I really only know Yaoi Rozu and Ishido so far. The boy's smile is contagious though. Boo. He curiously cocks his head to the side as he inquires to know which of his classmates Kyoka is referring to. Kyoka pauses as she tries to think of a way to describe them. A faint blush dusts her face before she mimes holding something invisible, you know. Yaoi Rozu is the one with the. Her blush deepens when Izuku realizes the positioning of her hands is in front of her chest. Izuku instantaneously turns red and shouts the first other distinguishable quality of the girl that he can think of, the ponytail. Kyoka looks away to hide her embarrassment as she nods. Why yeah, she mentally kicks herself for not choosing Yaoi Rozu's hairstyle to describe her as Izuku had. Eager to get past the awkward mood, she switches to describing the other girl that she befriended. And Ishido is the pink one. Kyoka's mind can't help but wander to thinking about the size of Ishido's bust, too though. She seems nice. Izuku's reply sets her nerves on fire when she looks down at her boobs and mentally compares the size of them with her female classmates. What's that supposed to mean? Kyoka's earjacks raise into attack mode to threaten the boy as the girl succumbs to a sudden surge of anger. "Ah, what the I'm just saying she's a nice person." Izuku throws his hands up defensively while reeling back from the menacing display of the girl's quirk. He nearly falls off the roof's ledge as he tries scooting away to avoid getting assaulted by the pulses of her heartbeat vibrations. Fortunately for him, Kyoka's attack never comes. She simmers down with a huff. The girl crosses her arms and looks down at the tray in her lap. Her lunch stares lifelessly back at her as she thinks about Ishido. "She has a crush on you. I think." Oh, Izuku's blush returns just as it was about to leave. He looks down at his own lap where he fiddles with his hands, his own thumbs wrestling themselves. Kyoka shyly raises her eyes to look at him, blushing as deeply as he is. The girl's earjacks begin to squirm with her body as she sheepishly tries to tell Izuku something else. "I also. You know." Sirens suddenly screech through the school's speaker system, the blaring noise making the girl stop mid-sentence to instinctively cover her ears with a grimace. Izuku pulls his legs up from the roof's ledge so that he can stand and look around. Kyoka slowly gets to her feet to glance towards the stairwell from which the noise is the loudest. The prolonged sound is an alarm that reverberates throughout the entire building as much as it rings outside. Izuku steps towards the ridge of the roof, peering over its ledge. From there, he can see the UA barrier has been breached by a crowd of paparazzi somehow. Instead of the security systems gatekeeping people out, everyone is pouring in through the entrance. It's just a bunch of reporters. Izuku looks to his side to see Kyoka has joined him at the ledge to look over with him. "We should be fine so long as we stay up here." He can't help but look past the reporters and still feel a cause for concern though. The barrier doesn't appear to be malfunctioning. It looks damaged. He doesn't voice his thoughts to worry Kyoka, but he can't imagine a reporter destroying UA's gate just to get a scoop should they receive reprimanding for property damage. Izuku's gaze sweeps the grounds from the wall to the line of cherry blossoms. There, breaking off from the pathway and using the paparazzi as a distraction, Izuku spots someone in a black hoodie. "I bet everyone in the cafeteria is panicking." Kyoka's own musings break his hyper-focus on the intruder, but he doesn't quite lose sight of the trespasser either. He keeps his eye on the direction that the prowler is heading while listening to Kyoka say, "We should probably let them know it's a false alarm." Izuku nods as he backs up towards the stairwell to head inside. "Yeah. Good idea." He turns and begins to pick up his pace when he resolves himself to pursue the intruder that he saw entering the school. "You stay here and let me deal with it. There's no need for both of us to get caught up in the chaos," but not without glancing over his shoulder to ensure Kyoka's safety isn't put at risk. "Oh? Sure." The boy is gone by the time Kyoka blinks back her confusion. She idly glances back down from her rooftop view, seeing her teachers have arrived to hold back the media frenzy and get the situation under control. President Mick shouts at them to leave, his yelling almost as loud as the emergency siren's shrill shriek. The sound of Izuku's red sneakers slapping the school's tiled floor is barely audible under the mixture of raucous noises. Coupled with the shouts of distant students in the hallway over stampeding on top of one another, the boy is able to move through the corridors undetected. Izuku knows that his unnoticed movements don't bode well for the heroes catching UA's intruder, should they be moving more stealthily than he. It's up to him to find and stop the trespasser somehow in such a case. So when Izuku finds the teacher's lounge left alone with its door ajar, he knows that he has to hurry. The boy frantically enters the room, nearly tripping on the carpet, and stumbles into a plush couch. Across the way, between him and a small coffee table, is the hooded intruder. They're not just trespassing and damaging property, but they're stealing. The folder is flipped open, paper contents held oddly with one finger poised from each hand. "Hey!" Izuku shouts to get the thief's attention. The hooded intruder glances upwards, startled by the call-out. A pair of beady red eyes peer out from shadowed and dried patches of skin. Chapped lips paired with a scar sneer at the hero student. The man emits a dangerous aura that makes Izuku hesitate and think twice about going any closer or saying anything else. The raised fingers of the hands holding the school's stolen document slowly lower and touch down with the other digits. As though the paper had been thrown into a fire, they shrivel and rapidly turn to dust. Izuku's eyes broaden with his mind's horrific deduction of what the man's quirk is capable of. All it takes is 5 fingers to make contact with something for the touched object to decay almost instantaneously. With the paper evidence completely decimated, there will be no evidence as to what documents were viewed. A dark purple wisp of smoke starts to spiral until it creates a whirling vortex. The spinning motion creates a portal behind what Izuku deduces must be a villain. When a hot feeling bubbles up in his throat to make him cough, he almost believes the smog is a form of knockout gas. It's only when the copper taste of blood reaches his mouth that he realizes the bubbles were his own bodily fluid surfacing. He coughs into the crook of his arm, staining his sleeve. Izuku tries to step forward, but his body lurches with emotion, and he's held back by his illness attacking him during the worst of times. The hooded villain slowly backs away into the warp gate behind him, red eyes watching Izuku all the while. Unable to chase the intruder due to his disease holding him down, Izuku glares back. The dark fumes close around the villain and gradually shroud him in the vortex until the dissipation of the smoke takes him with it. All of the deep purple shrinks towards the left pupil of his eye, and then, it blinks away. The villain vanishes. Izuku clutches his chest, groaning as he crouches to one knee. For some reason, his heart aches for the mysterious criminal. Chapter 14. An olfactory illusion of smell permeates the air, a metallic mixture of copper and iron generating rust. The aroma is more delicious than any flavor. A young girl inhales the scent through her nose, her cheeks puffing up from the air flowing in until they turn red. She squeals like the little schoolgirl that she is while she blushes intently, skipping in the direction of the alluring fragrance. Her navy blue skirt flicks and swishes with every hop, swaying in sync with a loose red neckerchief tied around her kansai collar. Blonde buns bounce atop her tiny head as she prances merrily along the canal that stretches beside the desolate street of her neighborhood. She slides down the empty channel like it's a slide on a playground, giggling on the way down. Once she reaches the bottom, she dusts herself off and springs back to her exaggerated steps. A bridge running over the halfpipe stretches overhead further down the path. The sweet scent pulling her by her nostrils strengthens as she draws closer to it, the source coming from under the overpass. The girl skipping slows to a stop when she finds a group of boys crowding around the smell's origin. Quickly, before they can notice her presence, she runs to hide behind a torn tire tread and some filled-up trash bags. From the secret spot, she can see the boys are kicking another boy who's been beaten badly. The boy that's been hurt is slick with blood, and she knows when she breathes in the air that he's the one with such a mouth-watering aroma. The widespread grin stretches across the girl's facial features, tiny fangs glaring in the sunlight. A sharp kick cuts the already battered boy's cheek open, eliciting a spray of blood like the juices of a peeled tangerine. Some of the droplets dot the blonde girl's clothes, but a singular bit of residue lands on her chin. Full of delight, she licks the liquid from her skin and relishes in its tangy flavor. A pair of feline eyes narrow into thin slits as they watch closely, the girl's yellow gaze captivated by the scene in front of her. The boy being kicked around curls in on himself defensively, not even trying to fight back. Every bit of blood they take from him makes her shiver. Only when who the girl supposes is the group's ringleader holds a hand up to signal the end of the boy's misery do they cease the beatdown. Everybody steps back as though they're giving their victim some room for his labored breathing. All but the boss of the bunch, a spiky-haired blonde, who stalks forwards to get closer. The group's leader bends down to grab the bloody boy by his notably green hair, forcing his punching bag to look at him. Learn your lesson yet? The rhetorical question goes unanswered, and then the blonde boy slams the other boy's face into the rough cement of the canal to grind it back and forth. Know your place. Blood smears across the ground from the beaten boy's broken nose. A muffled moan expresses the boy's suffering enough to be satisfying for his tormentor to stop. The blonde boy then steps on his victim's back and uses the body as leverage to stand up. Stay beneath my foot. When the blonde boy spits on the submissive boy and adds, fucking villain. The blonde girl that has been watching the whole time snaps out of her trance. No longer does she marvel at the scene. Her grin recedes until she loses her smile completely, replaced by a pouty frown. Suddenly, she's no longer entertained by the band of bullies drawing blood from their victim. Yeah. Stupid villain. One of the other bullies chimes in with a cackle. The girl balls her pudgy hands into tiny fists as she listens to the rest of the boys join in on the mocking laughter. That same bully who's wearing a backwards baseball cap points towards their victim's feet with an elongated finger. Hey. How come Deku has All Might sneakers if he's a villain? A malicious grin stretches across his face as he suggests, we should take his shoes. The bullies' cheering in collective agreement drowns out any weak noises of protest that their prey can muster. They remove the green-haired boy's shoes without much resistance. A final few jeers about the boy being a villain despite their cruel behavior being highly hypocritical is what they leave their victim with after stealing his sneakers. Each of them climb up the canal to ride away on their bikes, leaving the beaten boy to wallow in his own blood. Only after all of the bullies have left does the girl venture out from her hiding place. She stares at the unmoving green-headed boy with something akin to pity in her eyes, looking past his physical injuries and considering the mental abuse he just suffered as well. The girl can empathize with the boy, having been called a villain herself. She wonders if the reason why the boy didn't bother fighting back was to try and prove them wrong. He has his eyes sealed shut, completely unaware of her presence. Her shadow looms over him as she tries to figure what about the boy could seem so villainous to warrant such a brutal beating. The boy appears unassuming, almost plain. Then again, nobody would imagine a young schoolgirl like her has such a vile villainous quirk either. The blonde girl frowns and shakes her head to clear out all of the negative thoughts swarming her mind. She instead does what she always does to push down those dark desires and impulses. She smiles. An ear-to-ear grin like earlier returns to her face as she bends down to the injured boy's level. "Hi." Her bright and bubbly squeak of a voice doesn't match her mood, but it completely fools the boy when his eyes snap open to see her grinning at him. The blonde waves to him despite being so close before reaching that same hand out for him to grab. "My name's Himiko Toga. What's yours?" Timidly, perhaps even cautiously, the boy matches the gesture with a shaky hand before taking hers. "Izuku Midoriya." His soft voice blows away with the wind that runs through the canal. Himiko pulls and helps him to slowly sit up. He winces from pain but bites back any complaints. When he's propped upright, he realizes they're still holding hands and quickly pulls his away. A blush blends with red splotches of blood on his face. Himiko giggles, a blush of her own fading in when she remembers the reason why she had been drawn to the boy in the first place. Oddly, coupled with a few freckles on his cheeks, she thinks he looks really cute covered in all that blood. A tinge of the taste she got earlier lingers on her tongue, making her mouth water. When her slanted eyes land on his shoeless feet, her smile sobers and she swallows her saliva to temporarily quench her thirst. Himiko's pitying look returns as she thinks about the bullies calling him a villain. Izuku surprises her when he musters some strength to the tone of his weak voice. "Why, you don't have to pretend to be nice to me, you know." The boy stares at her with eyes as fragile as glass that she can see the cracks in them. She falters as she thinks he's seen through her facade of a grin and discovered the cracks in her own mask. When his shoulders slump and he looks away though, she realizes that he's not reading that deep, that he's simply seeing the surface level of what he's used to. "I'm fine," his mumble is back to its delicate decibel as he lowers his head. It's Izuku's turn to be startled when he hears Himiko's tougher tone. "You're not fine." She stands up from her crouch so that she can broadly gesture at their surroundings. "There's rocks and broken bottles down here, so it'll hurt to walk around without shoes." The gesturing of her hands goes to his feet before she grabs at her own. "I'll lend you one of mine. If you wear one shoe, only one of your feet will hurt." The girl slips off a red sneaker and holds it out to the boy. It's her favorite, the color of blood, but she offers it with a smile anyways. What? Izuku's bafflement leaves him in a staring stupor. When he doesn't take the shoe himself, Himiko tosses it towards him. He reflexively catches it, snapping out of his daze. "And no, seriously, I'm fine. I don't need it." He holds the red sneaker out for her to take back while frantically shaking his head. The bright color of the shoe matches the blush returning to his bloodied face as he stumbles over whatever other words he fails to muster. Himiko hops back on one foot, her grin growing as she releases a teasing titter. "Then give it back to me." She turns and skips a small distance away before turning back and urging him on with a wave to follow. "Come on. Come give it back then." Hey. Izuku's brain slowly processes that the girl is running away from him. Hurriedly, he forces himself to his feet to chase after her. Wait. Your shoe. What is with Izuku grunts when he steps on a pebble. Suddenly, the blonde's tactic is clear to him and he's left with no other choice. He begrudgingly pulls on the single sneaker Himiko gave him. "You gotta be kidding me." Himiko half limps as she tries to stay ahead of the boy when he pursues her. Ow. The fabric of her sock isn't enough to protect her foot like a shoe sole can as she runs through the empty channel. Behind her, Izuku winces with every step in a similar state of self-inflicted pain as he tries to keep pace with the girl. Wait up. Stop. Izuku begins to close the distance between them when Himiko starts climbing the halfpipe to reach the road above. He clambers to follow her and matches her movements. The incline makes for a concrete hill to slightly hike, one that leaves both of the kids breathing heavily by the time that they reach the top of it. There. Himiko puts her hands on her hips to pose as triumphantly as she sounds. "Now we're out of the pit." The sidewalk makes for a more flat surface that the two can stand on evenly with one another. Until Himiko bends down to pull off her other sneaker. "Here. take my other shoe too. Now both of your feet will be protected on your way home. And no, thank you. Izuku tries pushing the offered shoe away, but it winds up in his hands anyways. He looks down at the red sneaker. The one he has on already fits surprisingly well. I don't need your shoes. But he still tries to return them. Then throw them away. Himiko waves the shoes away when Izuku tries giving them back. The boy's perturbed expression leads her to respond with an exaggerated shrug and an exclusive explanation. They're old anyways. He takes another look at the red sneakers, but sees nothing that would show they're aged like the girl says they are. Considering how young she is, they should be muddied or scuffed from playing, but there's not a single mark. The shoes are brand new. As though they had been bought just for Izuku to last a lifetime. Himiko looks at the boy closely, still trying to see what kind of path he'll choose to walk. Hey, Izuku, he blushes when she twists the kanji in his name to be affectionate and not Deku. Though he can also hear how serious her tone is. He can see her solid expression. Whether you walk on this side of the divide or that one. He can see the split between her quiet neighborhood and the clamorous city that the canal makes. And he can understand that there's something special about the way that she's addressing him that goes beyond just kindness. The sun becomes the settled heart of the horizon, illuminating the line between villains and heroes, with Izuku's shadow casted in the middle. Himiko squints to see whether the boy's future will be as bright as the sky or as dark as his silhouette as she says, I hope to see you standing proudly. Chapter 15. Subdued but otherwise bright light from the morning cascades the classroom through tilted window blinds. It's early in the day that a flaxen sleeping bag still resides out in the open. Hovering above the empty bedroll behind a broad desk are a student and the man that would ordinarily occupy that yellow sleeping bag. Izuku's overworked and underslept homeroom teacher pinches the skin of his temple in a vain attempt to soothe the headache that threatens to turn into a migraine. First your responsibility with Bakugo and now this, as Awa just listened to his student's story of how UA had been broken into and how the boy had encountered that intruder without alerting any staff sooner. I should have you expelled. He has half a mind to avoid dealing with another problem child, but thinks better of it when recalling the whole purpose of his job is to help with the kid's development into a reliable hero. If it weren't for Vlad and I scheduling beforehand, I'd have you be the one to miss today's field trip, as Awa mulls over alternative punishments that he could provide instead, but doesn't get very far in his thought process before other students begin filing in. For now, just take your seat, as Awa sighs while shooing Izuku away. Oh, good morning. It's good to see you arrive early for once, Midoriya. Tenya moves like a robot that hasn't been oiled as he gives his classmate a stiff wave. Perhaps it's much too early in the day even for him to fully function just yet. Hey-ida. I'm just here because I was meeting with Aizawa-sensei beforehand. Izuku's wave is so much softer by comparison that it barely lifts high enough to even register as a wave. He slumps into his desk's chair just as equally exhausted. He hadn't slept much last night, his dreams plagued by nightmares of the villain that he exchanged glares with. Ah, I see, Tenya nods as he sits at his own desk. When he settles in, he sees an unfamiliar face filing in behind everybody else and stands back up. Excuse me. I believe you're in the wrong classroom, he chops with an outstretched arm to stop a girl with vines for hair from going any further. But Aizawa grabs the boy's arm and moves it so that the girl can get through. Actually, class rep, she's supposed to be here. The teacher has her stand off to the side as he explains. I called her to our class today for a reason that I'll explain shortly after everybody is seated. Tenya's eyes widen behind his glasses before he drops into a bow. He bends deep at the waist, my apologies. Bifocals nearly falling off of his face that he has to catch them before they can. Who's the hot eye? The shortest student in the class ironically sits in the back that he has to strain in order to see up front. His eyes are as big and round as the purple balls atop his head. As some of you may have noticed, a member of Class 1B will be joining us today in place of Bakugo. Aizawa raises his voice so that the whole class can hear as he introduces the girl. This is Ibara Shiozaki. Please give her a warm welcome. Thank you for having me, she humbly places both of her hands together and gives everyone a polite bow. The vines serving as her hair are tied into a neat cross shape that drapes her forehead, showcased as part of her courteous presentation of herself. Not that I'm complaining to have a cutie come by, but I don't get it. The boy with a lightning streak in his hair runs a hand through his blonde locks as he ogles the newcomer. Sparks flicker from his fingertips, but they fail to jumpstart his brain as he scratches his head. As part of Midoriya's and Bakugo's punishment, they'll be alternating classes by weekly intervals, as Awa shoots Izuku a quick glare that makes the boy reflexively duck down. Izuku feels everybody else's eyes on him too, but knows better than to add on the detail about additional homework or the formal apologetic essay he's supposed to write if he wishes to make a vain attempt of soothing his situation. It was Nezu's idea to keep them separated this way, so if you don't like it, then take it up with the principal, as Awa finally moves his glare away from solely Izuku and fixes it on the rest of the class. So Bakugo is going to miss the field trip today. Uraraka winces sympathetically for the boy. Man, what a bummer that must be for him, and Ijiro mimics her expression with a nod. If all of you don't quiet down and get ready, then you'll miss the bus and nobody will go on the trip, as Awa shuts them up before any other students put in their 2 cents. He thrusts a thumb over his shoulder to urge them on while saying, hurry to the lockers if you want to wear your hero costume or gym uniform. Right. Depending on the sort of activity we'll be doing, our outfits might be ill-suited and just get in the way. Momo pauses to mull over her own decision, while everybody else starts filing out of the room and into the hallway. Where was it that the syllabus said we're going? Something about rescue training. Hanta glances around as he asks his question to nobody in particular. The blonde boy with a tail for his quirk blinks back his surprise due to having an equal lack of information. Rescue training, huh? Sounds like another tough day. He scratches the back of his head as he shakes it side to side with dismay. The invisible girl's floating school uniform perks up from beside him before bumping his side to get him as excited as she is. Are you kidding? Come on. This is what being a hero is all about. I'll be right at home in a flood, and the greenette with some resemblance to a frog can't help but agree with her fellow female. Ijiro flashes a pointy-toothed grin as he listens to his classmates and becomes as equally excited about the school trip. Though he also notices Ibara is being awfully quiet in their company. He turns to her in an attempt to get her to join in on the conversation. What about you, new girl? She smiles kindly at him, seeming to appreciate the attempt to get her involved. I'm grateful to be a part of today's trip if it means learning how to help others. The sun beams through a window that they're passing, so that Ibara almost appears to have an angelic halo hovering over her viney head while she answers. So modest. A good number of the class are awestruck by how humble the girl is. When the class reaches the locker rooms, they begin to split based on gender. Rescue training is completely different from battling, you know, the boy with a lightning streak in his hair brushes shoulders with Izuku as he passes by. You probably shouldn't use your quirk, Midoriya, and mumbles under his breath, whatever it is. Overhearing the comment, Tenya frowns and steps in between them. I told you, Midoriya is our fellow classmate and I won't tolerate any sort of bullying. It's not the first time somebody said something ill-minded, but he feels the need as class representative to intervene this time. Especially when in the presence of Izuku himself. It's okay, Iida, I deserved that. Izuku gently pulls Tenya away by the shoulder as he feigns a chuckle to laugh it off. When Izuku's hand falls away, it lingers somewhere in the middle that he finds himself staring at it. I know how destructive my quirk can be. I don't need you or Azawa reminding me all the time. But then again, I did use it anyways when I fought with Kabakugo. So. Yeah. The boy that usually hangs around the lightning-themed blonde cocks his ball-covered head to the side. Why did you use your quirk on Bakugo if you knew it would hurt him? Izuku turns his gaze from his hand to his classmate, the same reason he used his quirk on me. Or, at least, I hope for the same reason the reminder that Bakugo fraud is equally haphazardly gets some of the boys to look away. We each had something to prove to one another, and we'd have just been disrespecting the other had we not used our quirks to go all the way. But Izuku hadn't intended for the equal share of blame to be his justification that he continues with his explanation and elaborates to give them his true reasoning. I guess that makes sense. Hanta pulls on the top of his hero uniform before glancing towards the others to see what they think. Izuku begins getting changed when he realizes the others are nearly ready to leave the lockers too. I don't completely get it, but it sounds like a manly enough reason to me. Ijiro flashes a thumbs up to show his support, which gets Hanta to smile and give the same gesture. Midoriya, all eyes suddenly flick to the boy at the back of the locker room. He's usually quiet, keeping mostly to himself. However, from his lone bench, the even split of contrasting colors in his hair stands out as much as his voice now as he asks, do you regret your decision? Izuku finds his classmate's heterochromic gaze and holds it for a second. The question is one that Izuku would have never considered until now. He breaks eye contact to look at himself. His bare chest exposes the dangling pulley string attached to his sternum. Unlike some of his classmates who are stuck with additional appendages like a tail or who are completely invisible at all times, he can choose whether to activate his quirk or not. Midoriya. Tenya cautiously and gently prods at Izuku when he sees his peer spacing out. It's okay, the heterochromic hero student stands up. And hurriedly heads for the exit, you don't have to answer that. Izuku looks after his classmate but doesn't call out or chase after him. Let's not dally, everyone, especially when Tenya gives him and the other boys a stern reminder that Izawa is waiting for them to finish getting dressed for the trip. When they all do finally finish changing, they funnel out towards the front of the school where they find a bus waiting. It's good to see you all made it here, Izawa dramatizes his impatience by checking his wrist for a watch that isn't there, you're only half a minute late. Sorry sensei. However, we shall make up for time with my seating chart. Everyone line up according to your ID numbers and fill those seats in an orderly fashion. Tenya takes charge with one hand chopping in a directory pattern while the other presents a drawing he made for them to follow. Iida's going full throttle. Uraraka sweat drops as the class rep instructs everyone to load into the bus in an orderly fashion. She's torn between wanting to laugh or cringe. Is he always this diligent? Ibarra follows in line with everyone else but still whispers a question to the pinkette that she's with. That's one way of putting it, Mina grins. She doesn't even try to stifle her giggle. But all of the effort the class rep puts into their seating comes to a crashing halt once they actually begin to board the bus. Gah. Darn. It was this type of bus. Tenya sulks when he sees the layout is completely different from what he had planned. All that work for nothing, Momo shakes her head at the sorry sight before taking her seat. As Izuku finds his own, Kyoka tags along and sits beside him. Hey, she greets him as casually as she can before asking, you holding up okay? Yeah, Izuku schools his expression to hide whatever he was letting show through in case the locker room incident shook him up more than he had thought before replacing it with a smile, thanks for asking. Suddenly, Mina practically falls backwards to shove her way between him and Kyoka. Mind if I squeeze in here, Midori? Her usual grin looks mischievous to Ibarra that the religious girl finds another place to sit. Recalling what Kyoka had told him on Yue's roof, Izuku finds it difficult to quell his anxiety with how close of a proximity she's made for herself with him. Ribbit, the frog-like greenette of the class chimes in from the other side of the boy. Izuku is startled at first, but feels slightly thankful for the distraction when she takes his attention for herself. Midoriya, I generally say what's on my mind, though he's fully aware of how she wedged herself in as well. Is that so? Izuku tilts a curious head to the side as he braces himself for whatever it is that she has to say. Past Mina, Kyoka turns an ear to listen in too. I can't help but wonder why you keep your quirk so secretive. The greenette places a finger on her chin as a thoughtful gesture. It makes me feel like you have something to hide that you don't want us all knowing about. Eavesdropping across the way, Ijiro nods along. Yeah, man. I respect privacy and all, but it kinda hurts that you aren't willing to trust us. He tries to be as delicate as he can when broaching the topic after the boys' locker room conversation, but voices his own opinion on the matter. Once again, the bi-colored boy in the back of the bus shocks everyone by chiming in, could you be the secret love child of All Might and you don't want to reveal your relation by displaying a similar strength quirk? That's oddly specific. Uraraka blinks a few times as she processes the boy's theory. Todoroki has a point though. Hanta snaps his fingers as though the conspiracy has just been cracked before pointing towards Izuku for confirmation. Dude, are your parents pro-heroes? No. Sorry to get anybody's hopes up, Izuku quickly shakes his head to debunk the hypothesis and glances at everyone apologetically when he sees some of them becoming sullen with disappointment. What then? Are they villains? The boy with a lightning streak in his blonde hair crosses his arms as he leans back and jokingly presents his own proposition. When he sees Izuku's reaction, he uncrosses them and leans forward. Oh my god. Are they? No. They're not. Izuku immediately denies the boy's claim, but recoils when he realizes that he may have done so too forcefully. He sees some of his class aren't convinced by his hasty response. I met his mom. Kyoka frowns at the students shying away from Izuku and defends him as best as she can. She's super sweet, so. She's not a villain. Izuku casts her a sidelong grateful glance. Mina swivels her head from the girl on her one side to the boy on her other to ask, what about your dad, Midori? Izuku shifts uncomfortably as he nervously scratches the back of his head. He works overseas, so I hardly get to see him. He looks down at his feet to avoid making eye contact with his class, worried that they won't believe him. I bet his dad's a villain, the same blonde from before mutters in a not-so-quiet whisper. The bald-headed boy he normally hangs around with nods in agreement. Izuku closes his eyes, having expected that kind of response. Ioka frowns, hearing them loud and clear thanks to her quirk. When the bus bounces over a speed bump, she shoots one of her jacks out to jab the blonde in the neck. Whoops. Missed my charging port. She feigns the attack as an accident while pumping her heartbeat into the boy in order to give him a shock. Once the class gets the message loud and clear, she returns to her seat. Look everyone. Maybe we should talk about something else. No need, but Aizawa stops the class discussion when he stands up from the front of the transportation vehicle. The bus comes to a stop as he announces their arrival. We're here. Whoa. Several students twist in their seats to look out the window and exclaim in awe. Wow. It looks like a giant dome. Ijiro marvels at the massive structure that resides at the top of a stone staircase just outside the bus. Is it an observatory? Mina excitedly hops off the bus as she examines the building's curvaceous shape for herself. Maybe it's a planetarium. The invisible girl bounces beside her while suggesting an alternative reason for the strange design. We're doing rescues in an observatory planetarium. The tailed blonde of the class deadpans as he steps in between them to get a look at the structure too. Okay. Maybe not either of those. Mina scratches her head when she realizes her singular brain cell, even when combined with another, won't be enough to guess what's inside. You'll all see soon enough, Aizawa grumbles more so to himself as he leads his class up the steps of the tall staircase. When he pushes the doors open, he closes his eyes and wishes he could plug his ears as he prepares for the next barrage of overly excitable exclamations. Wow. Maybe it's Universal Studios Japan. Uraraka makes her own guess when she sees all sorts of varying environments that look like sections of an amusement park. Aizawa sighs as he tries to correct her and explain to everyone where they're really at. No, it's the USJ. It is Universal Studios Japan. But Mina's girlish squeal of joy cuts him off before he can get another word out. It's not. Aizawa's eyes snap open as she shouts for everyone to quiet down. Once the rambunctious bunch settles for occasional murmurs, he tries again. USJ stands for Unforeseen Simulation Joint. This is where you'll be simulating rescues in various unforeseen disaster scenarios. The homeroom teacher tries not to yawn as he gives his tired explanation. That's right. There's a conflagration zone for fires, a landslide zone, a flood zone, and more. I ought to know. I built this facility myself. An astronaut-themed hero climbs a staircase to join everyone at the entrance, while piggybacking off of Aizawa's description of the USJ. Whoa. It's 13. To which Uraraka practically glows with delight. The brunette instantly recognizes the rescue hero. Yes, 13 will be overlooking today's trip as a special guest. Aizawa's dull tone is a sharp contrast by comparison, but he still tries to wave his arm with a mild flourish anyways. 13, take it away. And away we shall go. But first. Some points to make. 13 raises a gloved finger to get everybody's attention. A few students chuckle or snort at the pun. When the tip of the poised finger pops open like a bottle cap, they gasp in shock. I'm sure many of you are aware that my quirk is called Black Hole. It can suck and tear anything apart. A wispy fog edges from the brim of the opening that makes up the hero's quirk to which they are referring. You used it to save a ton of people from disasters. Uraraka enthusiastically nods while raising her arms over her head to be called on, should the hero ask them about their quirk. Indeed, 13 gives the girl a single nod of acknowledgement. But takes a serious tone that sobers Uraraka quickly, however. 13's head swivels to look at everyone. My power can easily kill. Izuku sees his own reflection in the hero's black face visor. I've no doubt there are some of you here with similar abilities. In our superpowered society, the use of quirks is heavily restricted and monitored. It may seem that system is a stable one. But we must never forget that it takes one wrong move with an uncontrollable quirk for someone to die. Izuku listens intently as the hero's words resonate with his beating heart. During Aizawa's physical fitness test, you came to learn of your hidden capabilities and potential. 13 seems to be looking directly at him now. Through All Might's battle training, you discovered the danger your quirks can pose to each other, and Izuku understands why he was allowed to attend this lesson even after his mistakes. Combining those lessons, this session will teach you how to properly regulate your power to save lives. Bravo. Amazing. It all comes full circle. As expected of UA. Tenya claps with exaggerated movements as he looks around at his peers to get them to join in his applause. I'm not finished yet, but 13 makes him realize his mistake and he ceases the praise abruptly. My apologies. Tenya bows at the waist to hide his fierce blush of embarrassment. A few snickers and giggles surround him. Their powers are not meant to inflict harm. Izuku finds himself staring into the blank space of 13's face mask once again. I hope that you leave here today with the understanding that your quirks are meant to help people and not hurt them. Then, Izuku's eyes are drawn to a whirling vortex of ornate purple, the dense fog flickering and licking at the turbulent air. It's a gateway to danger, and the danger is coming through. At the center of the USJ, the water fountain stops working. So do the lights lining the roof. Every bolt bursts and blows out as the power stops functioning. That behind me. Aizawa notices now that there's a major shift in the atmosphere and jumps in front of his class with reckless abandon. A pair of yellow goggles cover his eyes as he unfurrows the capture cloth that he usually keeps wrapped around his neck. Izuku and the others see why their teacher is suddenly so defensive when a collection of other costumed people begins pouring in through the winding vortex. It's a gateway reminiscent to a black hole, as ironic as 13's quirk disclosure had been when comparing the two. What the heck is that? More robots like the entrance exam? Ijiro squints his eyes as he tries to get a look at the people coming through the warp gate. Is that Class 1B? Mina looks at Abara in the hopes that they're being joined by the other hero students. When Abara shakes her head, face paling, the Pinkett skin tone loses color too. Nobody move. Those are real villains. Aizawa grits his teeth together as he watches the endless march of enemies entering the facility. Wave after wave, the amount of opponents piles up until the hero students are outnumbered. Below, the crowd of villains part as three figures stride out of the portal. First, a slender young man with silvery blue hair, his baggy black articles of clothing clipped tight in clenched hands that seem to hang off and perch across his body. Two of those severed limbs are clasped around his neck like a noose, and one looks almost like a gas mask as it wreathes his mouth in the purple fog. To his back, a massive form strides out with heavy stomps of large feet, hunched over as it looms around him. Black-skinned and clawed hands, with a beaked jaw that peeks out from beneath an exposed brain. Across its arms and back, deep gashes and scars are embedded into its skin. None of those valleys of the dark canyon are stretched apart to show raw muscle fiber. The violet mist that makes up the portal swirls together to form a strange man-shaped silhouette with a layered metal collar. His body is nothing but flickering smoke and shadow, with two gaslight eyes that peer around. As the three villains come to a stop, the leader, who's wreathed in severed hands, glances up and around. Even this far away, Kyoka can hear the leader's voice without issue, and judging from the shifting of Izuku's head, he can make it out too. Around them, the class is panicking and shouting about how this isn't possible. But those who can hear the villains are far more focused on the threat at hand. I was expecting All Might would be here. What a shame, the villain leader hums as he scratches the underside of his neck with a casual yet unsettling demeanor. Aizawa and 13 whisper something between one another, hero to hero. Likely, it has to do with strategy. It could also have to do with the intruder during the media leak on school grounds being one and the same as the villain group's leader down below. Try both of those, but as well as the true discussion they are having revolving around All Might's absence too. When the villain leader says, maybe some dead kids will bring All Might running, Aizawa snaps his attention back to them. 13, get them out of here. He leaps into the fray without a second to spare. 13 springs into action too, heading for the doors to help the class escape as instructed. But they don't get very far. Everything happens so fast. 1 second, they're running for the exit. The next, they're cut off by a wall of darkness. The purple void is the same as the portal that had allowed the villains to invade the facility. Greetings, a chillingly calm tone sweeps over the class, the same as the villain's bulked body's shadow, as a representative of the League of Villains. It is my duty to scatter you and request you scream loud enough for All Might to hear. No. 13 is unable to stop the villain from teleporting the hero students in separated groups through their own personalized warp gates. There's no air that pushes against Izuku's face. He's not falling. He's merely suspended in place. The darkness pulls in, swallowing him whole, and there's nothing he can do to stop it as he hovers in what feels like a severe storm cloud. He knows that the entry to this vacuity has closed behind him. Yet, what's in front of him and below him is nothing better. He looks down and sees a deep dark abyss that's staring back. The darkness reaches out for Izuku, its hands trying to wrap around him so that he can be pulled down. It's fighting its own stubbornness of keeping him motionless. The void is beckoning for him to drop. Izuku falls out and lands in a pile of what would be soft sand, if not for the small sharp pebbles scattered in it. He's in a construction zone. However, he's not alone. Kyoka and Momo land on either side of him, followed by Abara from Class 1B. The girls don't notice him until he notices there are villains here just like there was at the plaza of the building. Izuku glances back only momentarily. He whips his head in the direction of sinister cackles. Villains surround them, not allowing him to take his eyes off the opponents. Looks like we've hit the jackpot, boys. A serpent-skinned villain runs a slim tongue along his scaly lips. I call dibs on the petite one. Izuku's heart thumps heavily in his chest. This isn't like the times Bakugo and the others dragged him to their usual spot to beat on him. This kind of scum wants to have their way with Kyoka and the other girls. Izuku grabs a handful of his shirt, the clump of material bunched up in his fist. When he pulls, the buttons holding his shirt together pop off. His other hand snatches the cord that's let loose. Surrounded by villains, he has no other choice but to tug on it. Izuku snarls a warning as he stretches the line, Jiru. Cover your ears. Then comes the roar. Chapter 16. Snowflakes drifting through frigid air sting Izuku's freckled rosy cheeks, each icy speck a bitter bite when it sticks to his skin. The young boy tugs at the snood scarf wrapped tightly around his neck, pulling the brim just a tad higher to warm his bottom jaw. His mother bundled him up in layers of wintry clothing to protect him against the cold environment while he goes out to play, but the cheap material of his coat isn't lined with enough fur to do the trick. Izuku shivers as his feet sink into the frosty floor below him, boots making the ice crunch. Snow rests upon the smooth surface of a park bench, making for a natural feather cushion. That same sheeting covers the playground too. Izuku blinks, batting frost from his eyelashes, before looking around. Tree branches have lost their leaves, brittle bark creaking as wind shakes snow from the renovated foundations. Chain link swings sway in the breeze despite being iced over. Slide tubes whistle through their vacant tunnels. More snowflakes drift down to lay atop everything, gradually adding another inch of the white powder. Suddenly, the small specks make way for a collection of them, the compacted shape of a ball whizzing through the air. It bursts open on impact with Izuku's face, showering crystalline fragments as the ice returns to a semi-liquid form. The boy sputters as the snow gets in his mouth and up his nose, forcing him to rub at his face to clear away the residue. He hears a girl's joyous laughter coming from the direction from which the snowball had been thrown. When he peels back his eyes to look at the culprit, he sees the blonde that had lent him her shoes not too long ago. Toga. Izuku whines with a pout over being pelted by a cheap shot. He had somehow not noticed her presence until now, allowing her to get in a good sneak attack. Now though, he can see the girl is bundled in her own winter coat with a bright red scarf draped around her neck. That's not fair. I wasn't ready. Izuku crosses his arms over his chest with a huff that creates a cloud of condensation. Lowering his guard proves to be a mistake, the lack of free arms or hands to defend himself, leaving the boy vulnerable. Izuku is wide open for another snowball that nails him in the forehead this time. He flails backwards with a startled shout, waving his arms out in front of him to deflect much too late. A mild mark of red glows from where the boy had been struck, snow specking the surrounding area. The girl across the way grins, flashing her pointed teeth. She tosses a spare snowball up and down, catching it each time in one hand. The other hand rests on her hip. I told you to call me Himiko, Isaacin. The blonde blushes at the same time as the green-headed boy when she refers to him by her personally chosen nickname for him. Izuku fights the urge to sniffle. He's not sure whether he's catching a cold or if he's having a hard time keeping his emotions in check. The only other nickname he'd been referred to as was Deku, and that had been more of a way to taunt him. To be on a first-name basis with someone who refers to him affectionately, and a girl no less, the boy is at a loss. Izuku panics and reacts by throwing those thoughts away, not sure how to deal with them. He tosses them in the form of a snowball, scooped and hastily crafted to be made on short notice. It's a small projectile compared to the ones Himiko had created. The molding isn't very firm, and the boy's throw is pretty weak. So, Izuku's snowball breaks apart mid-air, missing its mark by several feet. The spray of particles return to packed flakes on the ground. Izuku stands still, wide-eyed in reaction to his own stunt, arm kept completely extended. He has trouble processing his attempt at a retaliation, just as much as he finds it difficult to process his failure. Himiko is just as surprised, gaze flicking between the boy and the snow on the ground. Her mouth is agape, teeth parted as she exhales in disbelief. He should see it coming this time. He should try to dodge or shield himself. But, Izuku gets pelted in the face yet again, this time by the spare snowball Himiko had kept on reserve. The boy staggers back, unbalanced as he's knocked out of his stiff state of freezer. The red spot on his forehead had made for a perfect target, swelling even brighter now that it has been struck twice. Izuku nearly trips over himself running for cover to avoid any additional fire. Just like that, the snowball fight is officially begun. Himiko hides behind the lower end of a seesaw, ducking down. Izuku does a little hop and then spins himself on a merry-go-round to throw off the girl's aim. He slides to use a thick tree trunk as his shield when the playground equipment completes its rotation. 3 snowballs burst on impact with the bark. Izuku digs into the thick frost to begin sculpting his own ammunition. He combs the snow with his fingers until it becomes packed enough to fit in his palm. Compacting the ice into a variety of balls eventually gives him a small supply to work with. Then, he returns fire. His throws have a better range to them this time, even if they don't quite make their mark. Himiko crosses the terrain for a better covering where the jungle gym is as he misses each shot. A laugh escapes the boy's throat when one of his snowballs grazes the blonde's shoulder. He hasn't had this much fun in a long time. When Himiko invited him to play, he wasn't sure what to expect after all the years of playing heroes and villains, but this is a lot better. This is just 2 friends battling on even terms. Neither keeps track of who hits who anymore as they keep chucking snowballs at one another. It doesn't matter. There's no need to keep score since neither of them is trying to win anymore. There's no losing so long as they have fun. The 2 chase each other around the playground in a fit of giggles and childish screams. Izuku stumbles to his hands and knees when they climb a hill. He tries to scoop up some snow to craft another snowball while he's down, but the coldness has deep chilled his fingers to the point where they now no longer wish to bend. Izuku drops the ice like it's hot, reflexively flinching before stuffing his hands into the crooks of his armpits. Himiko pauses just as she raises a snowball over her head, ceasing fire. She sees Izuku surrender and drops the artillery before jogging over to him. The girl crouches down to her own knees once she reaches the boy. What's wrong? She looks Izuku up and down for injury before noticing the throbbing hue of red in his fingers. My hands are sea cold. Izuku shivers as he holds his stubby little appendages out in front of him. The dampness from the snow has shriveled the boy's skin. His fingers tremble as they struggle to bend and fail. Himiko's slanted stare studies the red colorization of Izuku's hands. Her gaze has a predatory glow to it. Steadily, she grabs him by the wrist to steer a hand closer to her eyes. I know a way to warm them up. Her voice is a whisper that blows delicate clouds of condensation in the wind. Even though she's done speaking, she doesn't close her mouth. Her fangs glisten as sparkly white as the snow on the ground. Izuku is stunned into silence as he watches the girl guide his hand towards her mouth. He can feel the heat from her breath on the tips of his fingers. Right before the gentle nibble on the nail between her teeth and his flesh. Saliva moistens his skin again, but this time with warmth. Have you ever had your finger bitten? Her parted mouth speaks with a gentle tone that's barely muffled by the digit. Izuku's face begins to heat up along with his hand when Himiko's teeth sink a little deeper into his finger. It doesn't dig in enough to draw blood or hurt. It's just enough to be felt. Memorize it, the pointed fangs poke his flesh a little harder with an increase of bite force. Know it so well that even if you lost your sight, you'd recognize me by my bite. The sharp sting in his finger startles Izuku, but not enough for him to pull away completely. Himiko pricks him with a fang for a taste of his blood, the softest of puncture wounds. The boy focuses on the sensation that he's feeling with an extreme amount of awe. Though frostbitten merely seconds ago, he's suddenly relieved by a warm bite. I memorized it. Izuku says breathlessly. Seeing Himiko's hands are also uncovered by mittens or gloves, Izuku slowly reaches for them with his unoccupied hand. Her skin is soft when he touches it, as much as a cushion as the snow. Himiko gives him a curious look, shifting to surprise when he returns the favor of putting her fingers in his mouth. Though, she doesn't stop him. The boy follows her example and bites down. He does it too hard. Himiko shouts in pain and retracts her hand from his mouth when he gives her much more than a nibble. She cradles her bloodied fingers in her scarf to hide the crimson leak, but the red liquid smearing Izuku's lips is completely evident in the white weather. The boy's eyes expand that they appear as though they're about to bulge out of his head when he realizes his mistake. He blushes in embarrassment while Himiko blushes across from him for a different reason. I am sorry, Izuku stammers through red-stained teeth. His hands reach forward and retract, arms uncertain of what to do with themselves. He leans forward, trying to bow apologetically from his knelt position. He winds up falling over himself, landing palms down in the snow. I'm sorry. This time his apology is a desperate cry. When Izuku raises his head, his vision is blurred by the tears brimming his eyes. Himiko's blonde hair and red scarf are a smudged shape retreating from him. He lets out a strangled gasp that sounds more like a choked sob when he realizes that she's running away. Wait, he claws at the snow beneath him while trying to crawl after her. I'm sorry. His voice a blubbering wail. But just as suddenly she appeared in his life, she then vanishes. Her presence completely disappears as Izuku lands face first in the snow. He's left a sniveling red-faced mess of snot and tears, dribbles of blood mixing in to taint the white frost around him. His hands pressed into the ice suddenly feel cold again, fingers frostbitten and numb. I'm sorry. His voice shakes with the rest of his body. He's sorry that he scared her. That he bit her. That she ran away. Every apology was for a different reason. The next one, I'm sorry, a whisper only audible by the watery croak of his voice, is also separate from the other apologies. The quiet one that he doesn't want to admit as he swallows his sorrow is that he's sorry for liking the taste of her blood. He never saw Himiko during his childhood after that to tell her anyways. Surely, unless he were to run into her again in the future, he wouldn't even remember. Chapter 17. An affliction of gore becomes an inflammatory illness of emotions for the three schoolgirls watching such vehement brutality. Their innards contort like a corkscrew twist in a crude yet shortcoming mimicry of the virulent violence that they're viewing. Prevailing throes shriek into Kyoka's ear canals, no matter how hard her hands are pressed on either side to cover them, every paroxysm from the villains a sound straight from hell. Ibara covers her mouth to contain her own scream, though the girl's state of pale petrification is enough to silence her anyways. Momo wraps her arms around herself, feeling the moist coat of sweat on her skin. The cold dampness sends a shiver down her spine that makes her shudder. Covered in a crimson coat of his own, consisting of rancid blood as thick and dark as tar, the transformed state of Izuku hacks at the villains that dare come too close to the whirring of his chainsaw limbs. None of the girls that he's defending will be touched by any of the severed arms and hands he removes from his enemies. The tattered and torn remains of Izuku's unbuttoned shirt sways with his wild swings as the ripcord attached to his sternum slaps his exposed chest. A collection of criminals who remain out of reach turn and flee, stumbling over their own footing as they run away with reckless abandon. Others stagger or crawl to hold onto their remaining body parts while also attempting to escape. Serrated and wetted, the teeth of Izuku's chainsaw chains continue buzzing in a dizzying sharp spin. The fangs in his malformed mouth gnash together when his gaslit glare of smoldering gold track to chase the villains. An elongated tongue whips out of his maw when his pointed teeth spread apart, sloshing in saliva that flies out in varying directions. The roar from Izuku's throat rivals that of his revving chainsaws. More blood spills to follow the same trajectory as the boys spit, slapping the dirt below to dampen it a deep shade of red. Wailing continues to create tremors of sickening sound in Kyoka's ears as she tries not to scream with them. Ibara becomes so numb that her hands fall away from her mouth to make way for a spray of vomit. Momo closes her eyes as she turns her head away, unable to watch the bloodshed any longer. More of the red liquid splatters over drippings as Izuku chops his blade-mounted arms at the villains. Soon, a slick surface pools beneath his and their feet. Criminals slip in the makeshift mud and roll in the muck. The smell of fuel burning wafts over the landscape stench. Bodies made unconscious from blood loss are strewn across the disaster zone, collected in piles or heaps surrounding Izuku as he lets out a blood-curdling war cry. His chest rises and falls as he breathes heavily, the dizzying spin of his blade's chain starting to slow. Just as moderately measured of a movement, Kyoka uncovers her ears and shifts to blink back the horrific sight ahead of her. The new liquid, blacker than the rest, steadily slides down the motorized muzzle covering Izuku's face. Oil leaks from the corners of his lemon-lit eyes, a form of darkened tears falling. A choked sob escapes his monsterized mouth, hold me. His desperate tone sounding defeated despite the corpses left in the wake of his battle. The boy's arms hang loosely at his sides, the limp state more lifeless than the severed limbs surrounding him. Kyoka's shoes losh through the grime beneath her feet as she hurriedly moves towards Izuku. Despite the boy being covered in blood like a layer of fresh paint, she wraps her arms around his torso and pulls him into a hug. The girl presses her ear to his chest, right over the cord dangling at its center. She hears his unique heartbeat leveling itself out. The intense pounding from before beats a little softer as it turns gentle. Izuku leans into Kyoka's touch, chainsaws receding from their extended lengths and metallic face melting into a liquid resembling the rest surrounding them. He has a burning blush once the transformative appearance fades away, and he's back to his usual recognizable self. Momo's eyelids part hesitantly to see the aftermath, a sigh of relief escaping with the breath that she had been holding in when she finds Izuku in his regular state. Beside Momo, Ibara wipes away the vomit that had dribbled down her chin with a shaky hand. Ibara's trembling fingers curl to make a fist, the forced pressure reducing their tremors. Her white robe has been tainted by the stains of the fallen sinner surrounding her, soaked red and dried to stick to her skin. She shakes like a leaf as the vines atop her head writhe with the churning of her intestines. Ibara sheds some tears, eyes puffing up with her cheeks as she huffs in an effort not to fully sob. The devil. A weak mutter barely manages to slip through Ibara's trembling lips. Izuku flinches, "You're the devil." Then fully pulls back from Kyoka's hug when Ibara suddenly finds the strength to shout. Hey. Come on now. Momo hesitantly hovers her hand over Ibara's shoulder. She glances between the Class 1B student and her fellow classmates, uncertain of who to side with or comfort first. Midoriya saved us. Kyoka is quick to jump to Izuku's defense. A desperation oozes into her tone as she surveys the surrounding sea of blood. I can still hear their heartbeats, they're still alive. Her eyes flick from the bodies to Ibara and Momo. Ibara shakes her head, gaze still lingering on the mutilated corpses, her eyes refusing to meet Kyoka's. The anguished cries for God. I still hear them. The blood-soaked girl goes back to muttering as she counters her peer with the opposing sound that still rings in her ears. Slowly, Momo lowers her hand to settle on Ibara's shoulder. She gives the girl a gentle squeeze. I think she's just shaken is all. A tremor travels from Ibara to Momo that makes Momo's voice tremble as she says, we all are. I don't think any of us were expecting that. Despite the unsteady wobble in Kyoka's voice too, he was just protecting us. She remains resolute in her defense of Izuku. She chances another glance at the dismembered collection of villains by her feet. The serpent-styled one that had called dibs on her lay unconscious with his arms removed. You heard what they were saying. What they were gonna do, her voice shakes even harder and she tears her gaze away. I know. Just. Momo winces when she tracks Kyoka's sight to where it had been. She closes her eyes, willing herself not to look anymore either. It doesn't appear as heroic as it seems. She draws Ibara closer for her own sake now. It's okay, Izuku's sudden interjection makes Momo skittishly jump a little. She opens her eyes to look at the boy, reminding herself visually that he's no longer a monstrification of chainsaws. I understand how you feel. Izuku tries not to make any sudden movement that might startle her any further, and Momo suddenly starts to feel guilty for slightly siding with Ibara. Reminded of Ibara, Momo turns her head to see the girl is still on the verge of going into shock if she hasn't already done so. Using the ability that a quirk grants her, Momo creates a blanket from her fat cells to drape over Ibara. I'm going to stay with Shigaraki. Better someplace away from here, and internally shames herself further for using the girl's current condition as an excuse to distance herself from Izuku. She could probably use a change of scenery. Izuku nods in agreement. He then looks at Kyoka, you all could. Realizing that he means he'll go off on his own, Kyoka turns on her heel to face him in response. I'm not leaving you by yourself. She plants her feet once turned and places her hands on her hips. I'm willing to bet all the other zones have villains in them too. So our best bet is the plaza. Momo allows Ibara to lean on her as they steadily begin to move forwards. They try weaving around the bodies in their way as they do so. And we're going there together, Kyoka adds with an authoritative tone. Izuku opens his mouth to retort but thinks better of it. Neither Momo or Ibara complain as well. Alright then. Izuku sighs as he turns to follow them out of the disaster site. Let's get going. Within the plaza, their homeroom teacher is occupied still fighting off his own armada of villains. The underground hero starts with one, sweeping their legs out in a low crouch so that he can smack their head on the hard floor once they drop. Behind the slits in a yellow pair of goggles, Eraserhead's eyes burn a bright red. The villain he locks his sights on loses their quirk long enough for him to close the distance between them. Aizawa then knees the criminal 3 times in the gut. A burlier villain grabs a part of the fountain behind Aizawa, yanking out a chunk of the marble. The rock whizzes over the hero's head as he dives out of the way, saved only by instinctive reflex. The fountain piece strikes a support beam, bending the pole inwards as it shatters into debris. Aizawa unfurls the capture cloth wrapped around his neck, whipping out the opposite ends to bind themselves around 2 of the villains rushing him from his left side. Using the force of the pull it takes for him to duck down and dodge a punch, he tugs on the binding line to hoist each criminal over his head so that they collide into one another. Aizawa uses his footwork to pivot and twist his body with a strong right hook to take out the burly villain next. Simultaneously, his now unwound capture cloth snags the ankle of a different opponent in the crowd. The turning motion of the hero's torso switches to go the other way, pulling on the scarf to trip the villain it caught. Watching as the mob slowly gets eliminated one by one, the villain group's leader gradually grows agitated. He scratches at his neck as though there were stubble there, red eyes peering through the fingers of the dismembered hand covering his facial features. When Eraserhead crouches low enough to avoid being skewered by a katana and then retaliates with a kick, the villain leader decides that he's seen enough. Nomu. A raspy voice gets the monstrosity with an exposed brain to cock its head to the side. That same raspy voice then gives Nomu its order, hurt him, by pointing a finger at Izawa. The hulking black mass of slough and marred muscle lurches to its feet. A heap of unconscious villains lay beneath it, a less than courteous courtesy of Eraserhead. It moves as though it's unbalanced by its own bulk, the bulging limbs too heavy for its own body. The Nomu stomps on the skulls of the villains in its way, the crunch of white bone reminiscent of bloodied snow. It'd be impossible for Eraserhead to not hear the beast coming with every ground-quaking step it makes as an advancement towards him. The hero uses his erasure quirk, getting into a low crouch. Across the plaza, from a perched position on the viewing balcony of the disaster zone he just exited, Izuku witnesses what happens next. The Nomu's size is deceptive. It's fast. Faster than any of the villains Izawa was fighting earlier. It catches Izawa in a grip that clutches the man's entire abdomen. The creature's hefty thew lives up to expectations in terms of raw strength. Izuku can hear the sound of his teacher's ribcage shattering despite the distance. When Kyoka makes a horrified gasping noise from beside him, Izuku can only imagine what the bones breaking must have sounded like when amplified. Momo turns her back to the view, simultaneously shielding Ibara from the sight before the girl can catch even a glimpse of it. Those two have seen enough, each of them reverting back to their trembling dispositions. Their eyes clamp shut, unwilling to replay a visual bloodshed. Though they can still hear the awful yells coming from their teacher. They flinch with every agonized shout. Izuku grinds his teeth as he grits them together, trying not to scream too. Izawa's limbs sling loosely as he's played with like the Nomu's ragdoll. With the carelessness of a child slinging its toy around, the mindless beast roughly slams the man into the ground. Red paints the surface that slowly chips away with every grating blow. Izawa's eyes glare defiantly, the crimson glow as bloody as the rest of him. Until he's slammed into the floor face first. The cracked cement cuts his cheek open, splitting like a seam. Izawa's jaw unhinges to one side, dangling as his mouth rips even further. That's when Izuku reaches his limit. He can't just stand by and watch anymore. His index finger loops through the hole of the handle on his sternum's pulley string. Kyoka hears the rapid beat of the boy's heart begin to create a continuous rhythm. She doesn't need to hear him say, "I'm saving Sensei. Stay here with them." To know the revving is that of his chainsaws next. A red sneaker steps onto the guardrail of the balcony to use as a launching pad. When Izuku pushes off, his transformation transpires mid-leap. Wait. Kyoka's cry gets cut off by the whirring of the chained blades that burst forth. The elongated saws screech as they swing with Izuku's aerial movement. Each arm slices through the air when he begins to make his descent down into the plaza. A shrill shriek erupts from the chainsaw mounted atop the running engine in place of his head, the sharpened fangs within it bearing down with him. The hand-covered villain that had ordered the Nomu to attack Izawa raises his head, the swift motion flicking his tousled hair. When he sees the source of the caterwaul coming for him, he reacts immediately. Bladed tips brush by, every metallic tooth spinning on the edge of a long bar. The villain skids back, the heels of his shoes scraping the ground. The air between him and Izuku splits as though severed, further pushing the villain away. That same gust of wind blows away the pale strands of hair hanging over his eyes. The gaslit glow from within the dark slithers in Izuku's metal-mounted face stare back, an amber substitute for eyes burning brightly. The chainsaws attached to the boy continue their rotation, pointed tips a blur. With every intense rise and fall of Izuku's chest, the string attached at the base sways from one side to the other. The thrumming of the chainsaws shift in the direction of Izawa and the Nomu. The creature ceased its torture, awaiting orders from its boss. To the opposite side, one of the villains Izawa hadn't dispatched takes a broad swing with a steel rod. An emission of sparks glisten across the metallic surface of Izuku's face when it connects. While his head does turn with a blow, the rest of his body remains firm. The engine thrums louder when the yellow ore buying the villain intensifies its glow. The chainsaws at Izuku's sides rev louder before one juts up to carve under the villain's armpit from where he holds the metal beam. The bar drops to the ground with a resounding clang per 4 bounces. A scream from the villain having his underarm torn into follows suit. Izuku jerks the chainsaw out from the villain and swings his other arm's bladed saw at the next one's legs. Taken out at the knees, that villain falls beside the one cradling his blood-oozing armpit. A mighty step forward carries Izuku's overhead swing of his next attack that cuts down the final bit of cannon fodder in his way. The leader of those grunts raises his finger to point and direct the Nomu again. Nomu. Hurt him next. That same finger curls over to scratch under the villain's jaw. Atop the entrance steps of the plaza, Kyoka runs with Momo and Obara to rendezvous with a handful of their classmates. The ones fortunate enough to have avoided being caught in the misty villain's warp gate let out varying sounds of relief. Though 13 wasn't as lucky, having been torn open from the back in a brief battle with the portaling villain. Again, Momo has to hide the gruesome sight of a corpse from Obara. Even with Hanta at their hero teacher's side taping shut the wounds, it's tough to take in. Ijiro and the blonde with a lighting streak in his hair stand by the door that's now slightly ajar. Mina is closer for Kyoka to talk to. Kyoka is almost too afraid to ask what happened. But she's heard a lot worse today than anything her classmate could tell her. We distracted the villain that warped you and the others away long enough for Iida to get out. He went to get help, Mina summarizes the situation on her end while pulling Kyoka into a hug. Kyoka is so used to the Pinket being a light-hearted jockster that it's unsettling to see the girl so serious. It's even worse when Kyoka can hear the tremble in Mina's voice that simultaneously felt through their hug. The blonde boy beside Ijiro ventures away from the door and to the base of the stairwell towards the plaza. Then that villain turned on his boss all of a sudden, he points in the direction of where Izawa had been ravaged by the Nomu. When Kyoka peels back from Mina's embrace to follow the finger's aim, she recognizes the macabre of chainsaws below. That's not a villain, idiot. That's Midoriya. She tries and fails to keep the feelings of agitation out of her tone when she corrects the blonde boy. Mina turns her head to follow the line of trajectory next, raising her hands to her mouth to muffle her gasp when she sees what the two are talking about. That's Midoriya. Her voice shakes more than it did when Kyoka had rendezvoused with her. Ijiro sidles up next to the Pinket, openly gawking at Izuku's chainsaw state. Holy shit. He lets out a breathless whisper that sounds just as odd as he appears. Behind the reed, Hanta stands up to get a look at Izuku for himself. The grim expression he had while patching up 13 somehow deepens its intensity. Yeah. His voice sounds as distant as he is from the drop-off of the staircase when he repeats what Ijiro said, holy shit. The metallic teeth brimming the chain constantly looping itself around the bar protruding from Izuku's right arm begin to sink, they bury themselves deeper and deeper into Stygian flesh. An explosive burst of blood a shade darker than any ordinary red splatters in response to the entry of the spinning blades. Izuku continues sawing with his armbar, willing it to dig deeper as he grinds his arm back and forth. The hulking monstrosity called Nomu doesn't flinch. It doesn't even release a semblance of sound to indicate any sort of pain. Izuku yanks the chainsaw free when he sees the creature winding up for an attack of its own. The beast moves with a cumbersome exaggeration that it didn't show when grabbing Izawa. Izuku seizes that difference in speed to make it bleed as much as he can. The boy's left arm swings upwards so that the chainsaw protruding from it can carve itself into the Nomu's abdominal region. The muscle fibers there pulsate as though they're flexing in response to the foreign entry. Again, the Nomu reaches for Izuku, unbothered by the stabbing. Realizing the Nomu can't possibly be human to remain unfazed, Izuku begins sliding the chainsaw across its stomach rather than pulling back. He forgets about restraint, mercilessly twisting the cutting motion so that it rips apart the creature's innards. When Izuku does tear his chainsaw free, a spillage of intestines comes with it. He staggers back, surprised by his own ferocity. Except the Nomu follows those steps with heavy stomps of its own. Still, the lab creation remains unfazed, even after literally having its gut spilled. The massive hand grabs one of Izuku's forearms, the buzzing blade slicing its palm, seemingly doing nothing to loosen its hold. The boy is then lifted off of his feet, hoisted into the air as though he's weightless. He gasps when he sees from his aerial view that the Nomu's gut has begun reclosing. The monster has a regeneration factor to replace its removal of pain receptors, a dangerously deadly trade-off. Izuku lashes out with his free arm, no longer caring what detrimental damage he does to the beast, if that damage won't last forever to be detrimental enough. That arm gets caught in the Nomu's grip too, snatched by its other hand. Rip his arms off, Izuku can hear the satisfied smirk in the villain leader's tone. In his peripheral vision, he can see Izawa using his erasure quirk on the Nomu in a vain attempt to prevent the order from being carried out. Izuku tries reaching the creature's exposed brain with the chainsaw mounted to his own head, but falls short by too many inches. His feet dangle in the air from his suspended spot above the ground. Looking down at them, he remembers those are appendages that exist too. With all of the exertion that he can muster, Izuku raises his leg as high as it can go to perform an axe kick. His calf tears itself open, splitting down the middle. A chainsaw shreds its way out of Izuku's leg and embeds itself into the base of the Nomu's skull. Brain matter splatters every which way as it's grinded up. Finally, the Nomu makes a sound. An awful ear-piercing one too. The grip on Izuku's arm slackens. He twists them so that the chainsaws cut at the creature's fingers, severing the digits from its hands. Izuku hits the ground hard, landing on his ass. Black stubs topple to the floor with him. Nomu. The villain leader cries out for his wounded science experiment. The creature hears its master, but doesn't have the brain capacity to respond with an organ that's hardly intact. It staggers while grasping at its head with fingerless hands, helpless and pathetic as it nearly trips over itself. A wisp of purple smoke spirals until it creates a cloud. The foggy specter then shapes itself into the villain that had introduced himself to the class earlier. Izuku recognizes him as the one that can create portals. Tamura Shigaraki. I'm afraid we underestimated UA's golden eggs, the villain addresses his superior, as though the turning of tides is a minor inconvenience. Yellow slithers narrow as they meet yellow orbs. The villain gauges Izuku while reporting, one of the students managed to escape. Tamura turns towards his comrade with a glare that would kill if it could, Kurogiri. I'd turn you to dust if you weren't my only ticket out of here. The leader of the Fallen League claws at his neck while complaining in a lower tone, useless. All of you are unreliable. Shall I suggest a tactical retreat? Kurogiri maintains his stoic demeanor despite the threats from his agitated boss. Though Izuku can tell the villain is nervous by the way the smoke wafting from his body fidgets like an open flame. Suddenly, the doors to the USJ that had been opened by just a crack completely fly off their hinges. They're completely blown away, sailing over the plaza. One of which lands beside Izuku. The other crashes into the remains of the center fountain. All heads turn towards the sudden arrival of a presence that can be felt by sheer proximity. None other than All Might, the #1 hero and the symbol of peace, stands in the doorway. He sees the kids by the entrance first, all of them crowding around 13's body. The smile he usually has vanishes, have no fear students. Especially when he shifts his gaze to the scene within the plaza. All Might rips away the tie around his neck as he announces his arrival, I am here. Tamura stops scratching his neck, chipped fingernails lifting along with his chapped lips as they pull into a smile. No. He gestures with his raised hands towards the Nomu as it regenerates its brain and faces All Might, it looks like we'll be getting a continue. Chapter 18. The boy's soul bleeds translucent tears. As thick as the snot coursing out his nose, hot like blood but desaturated, his eye streams touch his trembling lips. A sour taste saltier than copper bites his mouth. Reflexively, the boy curls his lips inwards so that he runs his tongue along the sore spot, feeling the fresh scar of his busted lip from where his father had hit him. His sobbing increases when the sting intensifies. He pulls the corgi in his arms close to his chest, the dog's fur a warm and fuzzy feeling against his heart. Monday. He whines in symphony with his pet. The hug does nothing to soothe the organs itching though. His hands clench as his fingers curl over with a tightening hold, desperate to scratch, but still clinging on to the animal for a desperate ulterior solution to gain comfort. I can't take it. The boy hiccups as he strains his voice that's become equally scratchy. He wants to reach for his neck, but relents, still longing for his dog's affection to solve the problem instead. I hate. You hear me, Mon? I hate. The corgi tries wriggling itself out of the hug when the boy's nails begin to dig in, I hate everyone. Feeling the dog's resistance, the boy sinks his nails deeper to keep it still. Gripping the corgi with fingers like claws, his hatred carries over into his hold. In that moment, the boy wishes that everyone would just turn to dust and blow away in the wind. His sister who betrayed him. His father who hit him for it and threw him outside. His dog for not even wanting to give up a simple hug. He wants them all gone. All semblance of love rots and decays in seconds. The boy's hands become a destructive catalyst for his hatred. Anything he touches gets destroyed. Mon rapidly decomposes, flesh corroding as fur falls out. The dog crumbles to ash. He stares down at his shaking hands, stained with blood and twitching to scratch at the itch, now that he no longer has his pet to hug. His arms wrap themselves over his shoulder and across his abdomen to scratch his back. A self-given hug that gives him more pain than pleasure. His unclipped nails cut and tear into him, but still the itch remains. From that day forward, the boy stops relying on others to comfort his skin condition with a soothing touch and starts scraping at it instead. That boy later finds himself presented with a new dog. Not a gift from the abusive father that he killed moments after Mon the Corgi, but the man that had taken him in beyond that point. The boy took that man's name, Shigaraki, and left his old life behind to decompose in the ground. Yet, the orange mutt with a chainsaw poking out of its head reminds the boy too much of Mon that his past life haunts him. He hates it. The dog attempts to clamber up onto his mattress to sleep with him. He punts it off the bed, kicking the mutt so that it sails across the room and lands on the other end. It yelps and then whimpers, annoying the young Shigaraki further. "Stay the fuck away from me," he hisses in contempt. It curls itself up in the corner that it inhabits and stays there after that. Satisfied for the time being, the boy lays down and closes his eyes to fall asleep. That night, like every night, he has a nightmare about the awakening of his quirk. He recalls killing his family. The way each and every one of them deteriorated flashes through his mind. He remembers the way Mon died best though. Up close and personal. The touch. The channeling of his anger. Shigaraki snaps awake, eyes flicking open as he shoots forwards. His skin crawls head to toe like his mattress is infested with bed bugs. When he sees the dumb orange mud on his futon with him, he considers that it could be flea infested. If his mind itching more than his body weren't enough to annoy him, the dog pushes him to his limit. It disobeyed and came to curl up next to him in his bed. It hadn't learned its lesson. Shigaraki kicks it off his mattress a second time, this time much rougher than the first. "What did I tell you?" His hands pause in the air when they reach for the dog. They stop short and he moves them to scratch at his neck instead. The dumb dog cries in pain, retreating to the corner it had been in before. He figures the mutt probably just wants him to feed it. He's supposed to give it kibble and pour water in a bowl, but he turns over and covers himself with his blanket instead. He leaves that sort of caretaking for Kurogiri to handle. If the dog dies of neglect, he doesn't care. But the annoying whimpers all night long keep him up. He can't go to sleep no matter how much he tosses and turns or tells it to shut up. Shigaraki tosses his covers off and jumps to his feet. Despite his age, he towers over the dog, completely casting it under his shadow. It's smaller than Mon was. Though the breed is lost to him. He considers dusting it, but then worries his new guardian might be upset with him if he were to do so. If he lets it out of his room, it might scratch against the door to be let back in, and that'd be as equally aggravating. If he lets it out. Shigaraki chews the mended scar on his bottom lip. Carefully, with his pinky raised so he doesn't accidentally eradicate the door, he turns its knob to let the dog out of his room first. "Follow me," and then he heads for the front of the building where Kurogiri usually tends a bar. It's vacant at this hour with 0 patrons, allowing for him to be rid of his pest without being caught. When he opens the next door, a much larger metallic one with a screech instead of a squeak that leads into an alley rather than a decorative hallway, the dog looks back at him. "What are you waiting for? Go." Shigaraki shoos the animal away with an aggressive wave of his hand. It flinches but doesn't budge. Shigaraki looks back to make sure nobody is watching before forcing it out with a kick. "I said go." The dog shies away, just short of getting shoved but still lands outside. Shigaraki scoffs and slams the door to the bar shut. He leaves the dog outside by itself. Chapter 19. He breathes in the same breath of condensation that he had let out, that vapor vanishing among flickering wafts of steam generated by the warmth of his body. Crystallization with a diamond glow stretches across a vast expanse ahead of him, a dazzling sparkling community of dancing lights born to reflect sunlight glimmering on each jagged end of the curvaceously spired frozen landscape. The spiked terrain of ice had been a large body of water, the remainance of his form having been soaked completely evaporated now. The combination of cold and heat that the boy regulates keeps him focused on the sudden use of those quirks and not the other occupants of his surroundings. Todoroki. Over here. So the hero student has to blink back his initial surprise at the sudden realization that he's not alone upon hearing his name being called. His heterochromic eyes shift from the ship that he's on to the ice-sheeted surface below. Within the flood zone of the facility, it seems almost uncanny to be aboard what may as well be the Titanic in a self-imposed iceberg setting. The greenette at the bottom waving her arms to be seen is easier to spot in that sense. With a single wave of his arm, he expels another flash-frozen creation of sloped ice. This structure is slicker than the sharp twists at the bottom, so that he slides down it like a ramp. Once he reaches the end, he performs a graceful leap and lands beside his classmate. Upon closer inspection, the girl appears to be uncomfortable. The greenette is shaking uncontrollably. Todoroki raises a brow as he inquires, "Are you injured?" She shakes her head, no, but wraps her arms around her shivering frame to say, "I'm just not good in the cold. I should be fine once we reach the shore," though her eyelids droop so low that drowsy doesn't even begin to describe her disposition. Todoroki frowns when he realizes the effect of the ice aspect of the power bestowed to him can only be counteracted by the hot part of his body. "I'll keep you warm," he switches sides so that the greenette can be next to the part of him she needs to stay awake. The heat radiating from his body immediately relieves her vulnerable condition, her slouched demeanor shifting to stand upright. "Let's go." Todoroki leads the way to the shore and leaves villains frozen below the footsteps he leaves in his wake. Meanwhile, the footfalls of Uraraka slap puddles, every uptake of water splashing her ankles. The rest of her is just as drenched, caught in the simulated monsoon of the downpour zone. Trying to keep up behind the brunette with legs that have a much shorter reach is a classmate that made the odd uniform choice to wear a diaper. Ahead of them both is the bird-headed boy whose shadow somehow goes even a step further than that. The mass of darkness swats villains aside to clear their path. Where the heck is everybody else? Diaper boy wails like the baby he appears to be as a villain gets tossed over him. When Uraraka glances over her shoulder, she sees that the lines of water trimming her classmate's mask are from tears and not the rain. "I'm sure they just got separated into other disaster sites like us," she tries to sound assuring, but there's a grim undertone that doesn't allow either of them to forget their surroundings. "We need to reach the atrium. I'm sure that's where everybody will go to meet up." Another villain rolls across the ground, making the hero students hop to avoid getting tripped up. "I hope you're right." The boy's lip quivers with the urge to whine and complain some more, but keeps it at that. "Yeah. Me too." Uraraka's whisper is just as silent and heavy as the raindrops that descend upon her. Only the raven-faced boy hears her, his hum at an equally low decibel. The cacophony of spinning steel cycling through thick layers of flesh erupts within the facility's plaza. Savage swings from the revving chainsaws mounted to Izuku's arms release a resin into the air before the blood is calcified. The bladed teeth on his left bar extension skate off the Nomu's chest and leave another laceration. Slowly, the thick hide mends itself with more muscle tissue. A secondary swipe leaves a gouge across the Nomu's torso to replace the first Izuku created, this one coming from his right chainsaw arm. The brain he had torn into earlier has also repaired itself. Though Izuku remembers how long that took and the state of disarray the creature had been left in. One eye pops out with a splurt of blood when he chops down on its head. The Nomu screeches, lashing out with a swipe of its heavy hand. Izuku is caught across the chest, the beast's bare knuckles battering him hard. The force makes the boy hiss in pain as he's sent bouncing and rolling along the concrete floor. His eyes blink, the darkness shifting every time that he closes them. What he does see through blurry vision swirls and shakes like he's still tumbling across the ground. Izuku shifts to stagger himself upright, each breath exaggerated as he tries to regain his equilibrium. The cord that usually dangles from his chest is stuck in place by the blood that's been caked there. His legs wobble and he nearly falls backward. But then, he's braced by an arm as thick as the Nomu's. All Might. Izuku looks up at his idol and nearly loses consciousness. He's not sure whether he's about to faint from excitement or exhaustion. But when Izuku sees his homeroom teacher's battered body and the hero's other arm, he fights to remain awake. "Young Midoriya, can you take Izawa away from here and evacuate with the other students?" All Might's words barely register to Izuku despite the hero's booming voice. When Izuku realizes that Izawa is being handed over to him, only then does he process the order disguised as a request. He's about to protest with his arms extended, but then sees the absence of chainsaws. They can retract. He mumbles his revelation more so to himself as Izawa is transferred over into his open arms. When Izuku hears his own voice and not the modified filter that comes from a motorized mouth, he puts two and two together and figures he must have reverted back to his regular form. It now makes sense to him why All Might was able to recognize him. And why he's now feeling the pain from his battle with the Nomu. What's a hero versus villain battle without a little collateral damage? All Might. The villain covered in hands spreads his own like some sort of gentlemanly gesture before using one to snap his fingers, Nomu. In a flash of light, followed by the crack of what sounds like thunder, the Nomu and All Might are clashing with one another. Only after Izuku is knocked to the ground with his homeroom teacher does he realize the air force was caused by a sonic boom. The hero is locked in a wrestling match with the bioengineered monster. All Might presses with all his weight, giving it his all in an effort to tackle the larger black-skinned villain, grunting as the massive figure barely steps back. All Might's fist lands dead center with a solid smack against the Nomu's chest. But again, the beast doesn't budge. Only the darkened flesh of its torso dents inwards from the impact, seemingly like a leather or rubber coating of skin. All Might drives another fist into the same spot, doubling up on the damage. But still, the monster's abs don't cave in like they should. All Might barely has the time to raise an eyebrow before a clawed hand reaches for his face. Izuku tries pulling his awe away when another shockwave ripples through the air. The amount of times that he's knocked down is more than countable on 2 hands. The boy resorts to practically dragging his teacher's body. But even that becomes a challenge when the ground shifts with cracks. The floor starts to give and sink, and when the wrestling Goliaths slam one another into it. Uragiri and Shigaraki have a difficult time standing straight from all the uptakes of wind as well. The Nomu absorbs the shock of every strike from its combatant. Every blow bounces off its regenerative flesh. And each of those punches thrown gradually grow weaker as All Might burns through his energy. The Nomu roars, charging forwards to meet All Might in another clash. The two become locked together, fighting for dominance. All Might's hands grip tight to the creature's knuckles as it presses into him. The larger beast leans further forwards to apply more crushing force to the symbol of peace. All Might groans through grating teeth as he begins to feel the stress of being overwhelmed. His muscles tense and quiver under the intense strain. Inch by inch, the creature pushes to its advantage. There's a wince from the hero as he staggers just a step. But then he's sliding back, gasping for air while steam slowly drifts off his form. All Might pushes back with his own show of strength, finally overpowering the monster and throwing it off of himself. Witnessing the number 1 hero take a knee, Shigaraki begins to cackle with elated glee. So the rumors are true. You've gotten weaker. He then starts to clap at the performance his Nomu is giving him. By pushing All Might's limit, we created the anti-symbol of peace just for you, after all. When Izuku gasps, there's a gust of condensation in the air. The temperature drops. A spread of ice rises. Half of the Nomu's body is completely encased by the attack from Todoroki. He and the greenette he's with standing by the equally frozen bay of water behind him. You came here to kill All Might. Trash like you could never. He shifts his heterochromic gaze from the villains to Izuku and his teacher. His eyes widen when he sees the state that they're in. Midoriya. Sensei. The frog girl bounds to them with 2 hops. She takes his awa from Izuku while looking them both over, concern written all over her usually expressionless face. Brats. Shigaraki growls with animosity as he stares them all down. His glare only breaks away when the ice trapping his pet science project shatters. The cause of the smash comes from the living shadow protruding from the raven-headed hero student of Class 1A. They just keep coming. Uraraka and the shortest of their peers arrive as well. Although, how? The bird-headed boy gasps through his beak in shock when he sees his attack on the Nomu didn't disable it as planned. Instead, the monster begins to regrow the lost portion of its body. Pink fleshy fibers stitch themselves together in a grotesque tentacle-like twist until the hyper-regenerative process is complete. Doesn't matter. Nomu will kill them all. Shigaraki grins behind his facial covering, while the others blanch in horror. The beast responds once it's finished recovering by charging towards the children. But All Might intercepts it before it can make contact. No restraint whatsoever. Truly, you're the pinnacle of evil. He grits out his frustration through grunts of effort as the monster uses its full strength to oppose him. Very well then. I won't hold back either. The hero pushes past the pressure and inflicts his own on his enemy with all that he has left in him. A series of blows to the monster's abdomen are followed by an uppercut and a jab to its head. Every punch is barely perceptible, only conceived as existing by the quick blurs of every grating strike and the Nomu's recoil from them. There's a power behind every attack much greater than before that drives the beast back. Wind channels as it's pounded at like a punching bag, each shockwave gathering more and more pressure. Plus ultra. All Might goes beyond his limit while shouting the hero school's motto and delivers his final most fatal blow to the Nomu. All of the Air Force gathered releases in that crucial punch and blows the monster away with a tornado's power. The Nomu gets blasted through the ceiling and breaks a cloud as it launches into the atmosphere. At that same time, the ground that had been weakened with every blast of pressure as well also loses its hold. Every crack expands and the surface crumbles into a mixture of rubble and debris. Izuku slides down a cement slab that sinks inwards with the rest of the collapsing floor. Midoriya. The greenette girl that had taken his awa from him tries lassoing him with her elongated tongue, but he falls too far out of reach. An updraft of dust and smoke creates a cloud of thick brown and gray. Izuku chokes on what he inhales, trying to wave it away with one hand while covering his mouth with the other. He finds himself at the bottom of a sinkhole once the dust settles and clears. Sewer pipes protrude from uprooted dirt and gravel, spilling murky liquid. Across the way, he spots the villain that had been covered in hands, trying to reattach some that fell off during his own fall down. When the villain turns his hate-filled gaze towards Izuku and also notices that he isn't alone, each of them hurry to gain their footing. Izuku grasps the cord attached to his sternum and frees it from the patch of dried-up blood that's glued it to his chest. A sputtering startup almost makes him pull on it again, but the sudden flare of searing pain in his forehead stops him. His vision splotches red, and his face is slick with wet liquid that isn't his sweat. Izuku chokes out an agonized gasp and wipes at his eyes with the back of his hand. When his palm nicks the brim of a razor-tipped chainsaw blade, he realizes that his transformation was only partially done. The sharpened bar protruding from his skull sticks only halfway out, and the usually motorized muzzle that accompanies it provides no metallic facial shell. Not to mention there's a lack of chainsaws running on his arms. Izuku rationalizes that he's lost too much blood to be able to fully transform, since his chainsaws run on blood instead of gasoline. Still, there's a villain in front of him. Izuku raises his arms and makes fists. He holds a stance that's neither defensive or offensive, since he lacks the combat training needed to tell the difference. And still, the villain makes no move for him. Rather, Shigaraki tilts his head to the side and he gauges Izuku. He raises his finger, pointing as he tries to place his touch. Say. Your power looks familiar, boy. The appearance reminds Shigaraki of a similar sight. Izuku falters from moving forward, backpedaling instead. Slowly, one of his fists unravel, and he places his hand over the string attached to his heart. The cord feels like a live wire, pulsating with a sort of charge that gives him what may as well be an electric shock. It aches. I had a pet named Pachita. Izuku notes the way that the villain's eyes narrow at that bit of information. I can't ever hug or hold him again. The villain's stare lingers, something in the red of the gaze burning brighter than his hatred. Izuku curls his fingers over what used to be Pachita's tail, clinging to it with a reclosed fist. But he's right here inside of me. Shigaraki's lips turn over into a sneer, his tongue running over the scar striking through the top and bottom of them. That means Pachita is dead, doesn't it? The villain's response sounds more like a statement than a question. The tone suggests that Izuku doesn't answer, at least. Shigaraki continues, that there in my heart shit is a pathetic consolation, his hand hovering over his chest. He then bends down and picks up a chunk of rock with that same hand. All 5 of his fingers touch the small bit of rubble, and it begins to decay. The dead have no life. The swirl of the shadows behind Shigaraki suddenly creates the recognizable warp gate of Kurogiri. Izuku has half the thought to stop the villain from backing into it, but thinks better of himself in his current condition. As Shigaraki slowly slinks into the portal, but don't worry. You'll see Pachita again one day soon. He gives a few parting words. Then, the warp gate closes. A moment passes where Izuku holds his breath, wary of whether or not he's truly been left alone. Then, he gives out. His legs stop holding him upright, and his hands fall to his sides. In a slouched disposition, he releases a heavy sigh of relief. The thick atmosphere suddenly feels not as dense. It's more breathable now. The ache in his chest gradually begins to fade. The sound of a shoe scraping gravel makes him tense up again. He turns to follow the noise, but loses his balance and falls over, so that he has to prop himself up on one elbow. It's that error he made of showing his weakness currently that makes him worry that he's about to be exploited by another villain. But instead, he finds himself staring up at an equally fatigued individual. Huh? You're the guy I bumped into on my first day. Izuku recognizes the sickly skeletal figure as the gaunt blonde who had helped him find his class when first coming to UA. He momentarily wonders what the man could possibly be doing there before coming to a conclusion. Izuku's eyes widen in shock before he pushes himself upright and forces his body to get up. You must have been a part of the reason for the break-in. You're with the villains, aren't you? He accuses the strange person while raising his fists again in case he has to fight. The blonde's sunken eyes widen too, along with a gaping mouth. He raises his own hands but holds them up palm open, waving both rapidly. No. 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 You've got it all wrong. His pointed chin touches his chest when he lowers his head in a further effort to show his submissiveness. I'm no threat. Izuku eyes the man warily, sizing him up. The blonde's appearance seems decrepit. However, looks can be deceiving. What the hell are you doing here then? He presses for an alternative reasoning instead of trusting the stranger just yet. The blonde draws back, his expression a grimace. His squirming in place is suspicious, especially with the way he keeps casting glances over his shoulder. But eventually, the man resides with a sigh, agreeing to explain his presence. Take a closer look at me, young Midoriya. What am I wearing? The question puzzles Izuku at first, but then he recognizes the colorful torn fabric hanging off of the man's frail form. All Might. Izuku can't contain his reaction when he discovers the identity of the seemingly puny person he had first met in the halls of UA. Whatever expression he has on his face must match the tone of his voice, judging by the deflated hero's wince that's shortly followed by a timid nod of confirmation. I'll explain everything later, I promise. All Might lowers his thin arms, the limbs noticeably absent of any muscle whatsoever, that Izuku wonders if there's any meat to the bones at all. But I need a favor from you, young man. Please, don't tell anyone about my true form. Please. Izuku's green gaze meets the righteous blue of the hero he had always idolized as a kid, and he suddenly sees the vulnerable humanity in them that he never had before. Izuku is suddenly aware of how hard each of his heartbeats are. The heavy thumps make the string attached to his sternum sway ever so slightly. The chainsaw in his head begins to recede as he nods. He knows what it's like wanting to keep that same type of secret. If All Might isn't ready for the world to know about his true form yet, then Izuku won't let it be exposed by villains like his had been. Don't worry, Izuku offers All Might an assuring smile, your secret is safe with me. Now that will be unfortunately all for today's video, but do not worry, more will be coming soon for you to enjoy. Golden Fanfics out.